Richard Holt grabbed Caleb by the arm. Not a tap, not a touch. A grab, fingers closing around the sleeve of that worn jacket, yanking him sideways, just enough to make him stumble, just enough to make three people nearby turn and look. "Seriously, man." Richard's voice was low, sharp, and smiling all at once, the worst combination. "You drove 4 hours for this. Look at yourself. You don't belong here." Caleb straightened, slowly. He looked down at the hand still gripping his sleeve. He didn't pull away. He just looked at it. "Let go," he said, quiet as a closed door. Richard laughed, that comfortable, rehearsed laugh of a man who has never once been made to feel small, and released him with a little shove disguised as a pat. "No offense, brother, just being real." The people nearby smiled. One of them actually laughed. Caleb picked up his badge from the table, clipped it to his jacket. Didn't look at any of them. Nobody in that room knew who he really was. Nobody knew that in less than 2 hours, the most powerful woman in the building was going to walk past every single one of them and stop only when she reached him. Drop your city in the comments right now. I want to see how far this story travels. And if nobody's told you yet, hit subscribe. You will not want to miss what happens next. The drive took Caleb 4 hours. He hadn't planned to make it. 3 times on the road, he'd gripped the steering wheel, slowed down, and thought seriously about pulling a U-turn and going home. Back to his apartment. Back to his daughter's drawings taped on the refrigerator. Back to the only life that actually made sense to him anymore. But Sophie had packed his bag herself. That was the thing that kept him going. His 9-year-old daughter had folded his best shirt, the dark blue one with the small collar she called his handsome shirt, and placed it in the bag with the focused seriousness of someone 3 times her age. Then she'd looked up at him with those wide brown eyes and said, "Dad, you have to go. You never go anywhere." He hadn't had an answer for that, so he drove. He arrived at the Harrington Grand Hotel on a Thursday evening in late September. The building was 40 stories of glass and marble, planted right in the heart of downtown Chicago. The kind of place where a single night cost more than Caleb made in a week. The valet stand had 3 attendants in pressed uniforms. The fountain out front was lit in soft gold light. A long red carpet ran from the curb to the entrance, lined with potted white flowers that someone had arranged with military precision. Caleb parallel parked his 2009 Dodge pickup 3 blocks away and walked. He heard the party before he saw it. Music drifting out through the lobby glass. Laughter. The particular sound of a crowd that has spent 20 years becoming comfortable with expensive things. He pushed through the revolving door and stopped. The reunion check-in table was set up just inside the lobby, staffed by 2 women and a man in a fitted blazer. Behind them, a large illuminated banner read, "Meridian University Class of 2004, 20-year reunion." On either side of the banner, framed photographs from their college years were mounted on display boards. Faces young and laughing. Campus scenes. A football game. A graduation ceremony where everyone looked like they believed in something. Caleb scanned the faces in the photographs and felt something shift in his chest. Not quite sadness. Not quite nostalgia. Something quieter than either of those. He had been someone once. In those photographs, he had been someone. He stepped toward the check-in table. One of the women looked up, early 40s, good posture. A lanyard identifying her as a reunion committee volunteer. Her smile was the kind that arrives and leaves in the same half-second. "Name?" she asked. "Caleb Whitmore." She scrolled through a tablet. Found him. Printed a badge. Slid it across the table without meeting his eyes again. That was when the 2 men standing just to the right of the table, Caleb hadn't even noticed them until that moment, started to laugh. Not loud. Not the kind of laughing you could call out directly. Just that particular quiet, comfortable laughter of 2 people who are certain no one they respect is watching. Caleb turned. He recognized them immediately. 20 years had filled them out, given them the easy confidence of men who'd had doors opened for them so many times they'd stopped noticing. But their faces were the same. Richard Holt and Danny Prescott. They'd been inseparable in college, the kind of duo that forms a gravitational center at every party, pulling people in and spitting others out. Richard had gone into investment banking. Caleb knew that from the alumni newsletter nobody read anymore. Danny, he thought, had done something in real estate development. They were both wearing suits that fit them the way suits only fit when they're custom made. Richard's eyes traveled up and down Caleb's frame once. His jacket, his plain dark pants, his shoes, which were clean but clearly not new. And then Richard leaned toward Danny with a small private smile and said something Caleb couldn't fully hear but didn't need to. He caught the words, "still fixing toilets," and "some things never change." Caleb stood still for a moment. He thought about Sophie's face when he'd left that morning. The way she'd grabbed his hand at the door and made him promise to tell her everything when he got back. Every detail. "Even the boring stuff, Dad. Promise me." He picked up his badge from the table. He clipped it to his jacket. He looked at Richard Holt directly and said nothing. Richard's smile flickered. Just slightly. Just enough. Then Caleb walked past both of them into the party, and the laughter behind him resumed, and he kept walking until the sound faded into the larger noise of 200 people who had all in 20 years become strangers. The ballroom was enormous, round tables draped in white linen. A bar along the left wall 3 deep with people. A small stage at the far end where someone had set up microphones and a slideshow cycling through old campus photos. Everywhere Caleb looked, people stood in clusters of 4 or 5 drinks in hand, voices raised just slightly above the music. The jewelry in the room alone could have funded a school. The watches, the cufflinks. A woman near the bar had shoes Caleb recognized because Sophie had pointed them out once in a magazine, laughing, saying they cost more than their car. She hadn't been wrong. He got a drink, just water he was driving. And anyway, he'd never been much of a social drinker and found a position near the edge of the room where he could see most of the space without being directly in the middle of it. An old habit. He'd always been an observer. Even in college, he'd often been the one sitting slightly apart, watching, thinking, understanding the room, while other people were still performing for it. A woman named Gretchen, who he remembered vaguely from an economics class, approached him with that particular determined friendliness of someone working through a social checklist. "Caleb, oh my gosh, I almost didn't recognize you." She air-kissed near his cheek. "It's been forever. What are you doing these days?" "Construction," he said. "Restoration mostly. Historic buildings." Her smile held. Her eyes didn't. "Oh," she said. That sounds interesting. My husband is in finance. We just got back from 2 weeks in Tuscany. Do you travel much?" "Not really," he said. "I have a daughter. She's 9. "Oh, how sweet." The smile recalibrated. The small recalculation of interest happening behind her eyes was not difficult to read. Are you still with her mother?" "No," he said. "It's just the 2 of us." "Oh." And there it was. That small particular softening that wasn't quite sympathy and wasn't quite pity, but landed somewhere uncomfortable between the 2. "Well, that must be that's a lot on one person." "Yeah," Caleb said. "It is." She excused herself within 90 seconds. He watched her rejoin her group near the bar and say something that made 2 of the women glance briefly in his direction. He looked away before they could catch him looking. He'd been in this room 40 minutes. He was already thinking about the drive home. The next hour passed the way certain hours do, long in the living, short in the remembering. He spoke to a few more people. A former study partner who spent the entire conversation describing his stock portfolio. A woman from his freshman dormitory who seemed genuinely happy to see him, but was pulled away by her husband before the conversation got anywhere real. A professor, not one of his someone he recognized from the faculty photos, who shook his hand and moved on in the same gesture. At one point, he found himself standing near the display boards with the old photographs, and he spent a few quiet minutes looking at the faces. Looking at his own face in one image near the bottom, left 20 years ago, standing in front of the engineering building with 2 classmates whose names he could no longer remember. He looked young in the photograph. Not just physically young. Young in the way of someone who hasn't yet learned how many things can go wrong before they go right. He touched the edge of the photograph lightly. His phone buzzed in his pocket. A text from Sophie. Dad. How is it? Did anyone fall down yet? That would be funny. He almost laughed. Actually, almost. He typed back. Nobody fell down yet. You'd be disappointed. Her reply came in under 10 seconds. I'd be very disappointed. Come home soon. The cat misses you. You don't have a cat, he typed. I know. Imagine how much the imaginary cat misses you. He stood there holding his phone, and for a moment, the noise of the entire ballroom receded, and he was just a man reading his daughter's texts, next to an old photograph of himself, and it was enough. It was actually enough. Then Richard Holt appeared at his elbow. Whitmore. Not a greeting exactly, more like identification, like calling out a species at a nature exhibit. Caleb put his phone in his pocket. Richard. Richard had a drink in each hand, which meant he'd either been at the bar twice, or he was picking up for someone. He looked at the photographs Caleb had been studying. Then he looked at Caleb. Feeling nostalgic. A little, Caleb said honestly. Yeah. Richard took a drink. You know, I was trying to remember, what were you studying? Engineering. Civil engineering. Right. A nod that suggested the information was being filed immediately under irrelevant. And you're doing what? Construction, restoration, Caleb said. Historic structures. We take buildings that would otherwise be demolished and... Right. Richard wasn't listening. Caleb could see it. The eyes moving slightly, scanning over Caleb's shoulder for something more promising. You know, I keep thinking about how much has changed for some of us, and how, I mean, no offense, Caleb, but some things kind of stayed the same. What things? Caleb asked. His voice was level, genuinely curious. Richard blinked. He hadn't expected the question to come back directly. Well, I mean... He gestured vaguely at Caleb's jacket. Life, circumstances. Some people really built on the foundation, and some people just, I don't know, maintained. Maintained, Caleb repeated. No offense. You keep saying that, Caleb said. Richard's jaw tightened slightly. I'm just being honest. You're being comfortable, Caleb said. There's a difference. Being honest would mean you actually asked me something about my life before deciding you already know everything about it. A pause. Richard looked at him. For just a moment, a flicker quickly suppressed something crossed his face that might have been uncertainty. Then the mask went back up. The confident, easy smile of a man who had not genuinely been challenged in some time. Fair enough, Richard said and moved away. Caleb watched him go. Then he turned back to the photographs. He found the one of himself again, studied it. The young man in the photograph didn't know yet what was coming. The marriage that would gradually become the wrong marriage. The daughter who would become the whole world. The divorce that would hurt in ways he hadn't expected, and then eventually clarify things in ways he also hadn't expected. He didn't know about the historic Halbrook Theater in Detroit, that Caleb and his small crew would spend 14 months restoring, working through 2 Michigan winters to bring back something that a whole neighborhood had given up on. He didn't know about the letters Caleb still kept from the community members who'd written after the theater reopened. Handwritten letters, a dozen of them, from people who'd grown up going to that theater with parents who were gone. Now people who'd walked through the restored doors and said they felt like they'd gotten something back they thought was lost forever. Hy didn't know any of that. He was just a young man with good ideas and no clear sense yet of what he was going to do with them. Caleb looked at him for a long moment. You're going to be okay, he thought. It goes sideways in about 6 different directions, but you're going to be okay. He straightened up. I was going to get one more glass of water, say goodbye to maybe 2 more people, and then drive the 4 hours home to an apartment with a sleeping 9-year-old and drawings on the refrigerator and an imaginary cat that apparently missed him. He had already turned toward the bar when the doors at the back of the ballroom opened, and everything stopped. It wasn't dramatic in the way that movie entrances are dramatic. No wind, no spotlight, no music swelling at a precise moment. It was quieter than that, and somehow more powerful for being quiet. She came through the door without announcement. A small team moved with her 2 people who had the focused, efficient presence of those whose only job is to manage the space around someone else. But the woman herself was simply walking, not performing a walk. just walking the way a person walks when they've stopped thinking about how they appear and started thinking only about where they're going. She was perhaps 40 or near it. Dark coat. Hair pulled back cleanly. The kind of face that had probably been pretty in the ordinary way when she was young and had become something more specific with time. All the softness resolved into clarity like a landscape after rain. She wore no name badge. She didn't need one. Caleb saw the shift go through the room before he understood what was causing it. People turning. The conversations dropping in volume, then stopping entirely, then restarting in a different register. Urgent, excited, uncertain. Phones coming out. People touching their hair. Richard Holt. Caleb noticed, straightened his tie with both hands in a single quick motion. Someone near Caleb said in a low voice that cracked slightly on the last word, "That's Victoria Harrington?" And then the room moved toward her, and Caleb stayed where he was. He knew the name, of course. Everyone knew the name. Harrington Technology. $14 billion in valuation at last count, more than that by now probably. A woman who'd built something from nothing, and then rebuilt it larger, and then rebuilt it larger, still all before the age of 40. The kind of story that got written about in the kind of magazines Caleb didn't read, but saw in waiting rooms. He watched the crowd close around her. Former classmates pressing forward, introducing themselves, laughing too loudly, extending hands with the eager desperation of people who have prepared their 30-second pitch their whole adult lives for exactly this moment. He watched her move through them, polite, composed, shaking hands, accepting greetings, answering the questions she chose to answer, and letting the others dissolve without acknowledgement. A woman who had learned over a very long time how to be in a room like this without being consumed by it. And then she stopped. She stopped in the middle of the crowd that was still pressing forward, and she lifted her head, and her eyes moved across the room with a focus and intention that was so different from everything else happening in that space that Caleb felt it from 30 feet away. She was looking for someone. He watched her eyes travel the room, past the bar, past the stage, past the tables, past a cluster of people near the door, past Richard Holt, who stepped slightly into her sightline with an expression of concentrated availability and was not seen. Her eyes found the display boards near the left wall. They found the man standing next to them. They found Caleb. And Victoria Harrington went still. 30 feet of crowded ballroom separated them. She took it in 3 seconds. She walked directly toward him, and the crowd parted without her asking it. To people simply move. Crowds always move for someone who has decided on a direction, and she walked through the space that opened ahead of her, and she didn't look at anything or anyone except the man standing by the photographs holding a glass of water, wearing a worn jacket, whose daughter thought he should tell her everything, even the boring parts. She stopped in front of him. The crowd behind her had gone completely silent. She was looking at his face with an expression he couldn't read, something between recognition and relief, and something older than either of those. "Caleb Whitmore," she said. It wasn't a question. He looked at her. "Do we know each other?" Her jaw moved slightly. Something in her throat shifted. Her eyes, and this was the part that would stay with him. He knew it even as it was happening, her eyes were full. "We don't," she said quietly. "But I've been looking for you for 3 years." The silence in the room was absolute. Every person who had laughed at him that evening was watching. Every person who had looked through him or past him or decided in a single glance that he had nothing worth knowing. Every one of them was watching as the most powerful woman in the room stood in front of the man they'd written off and said the words that none of them had any framework for. Caleb set down his water glass on the edge of the display board. "Then I think," he said carefully, "you'd better tell me why." The silence lasted exactly long enough to become uncomfortable for everyone, except the two people standing in the middle of it. Victoria Harrington hadn't moved. She was still looking at Caleb the way someone looks at a landmark they've been trying to find for a long time, with relief. Yes, but also with something almost like disbelief that it actually exists in the way they imagined it. Caleb looked back at her. He wasn't performing calm. He was actually calm, which was different, and somehow that difference was visible. 3 years, he said. That's a long time to look for someone. It is, she said. You're not easy to find. I'm in the phone book. Something crossed her face, not quite a smile, but close to one. You're not in the phone book, Caleb. Nobody's in the phone book anymore. Figure of speech. I know. She exhaled. A small breath, deliberate, like someone releasing pressure they'd been holding for a long time. Can we sit somewhere not here? Somewhere with fewer? She glanced briefly at the crowd packed in behind her, every face angled toward them, like sunflowers toward light. Fewer people who are pretending not to listen. Richard Holt, standing 4 feet to her left, looked at the floor. Caleb noticed that, filed it away without comment. Sure, he said. They found a small sitting area off the main corridor. 2 chairs, a low table, a potted plant that had been watered too recently and smelled like wet soil. One of Victoria's team members stationed himself at the entrance to the corridor without being asked. The other disappeared entirely. Professionals. Caleb sat. Victoria sat across from him. She set her bag on the table between them and then seemed to decide that was wrong and moved it to the floor instead. She was gathering herself. He could see it. Whatever this was, whatever she'd prepared to say for however long she'd been preparing it, the actual moment of saying it was harder than the preparation. He waited. I graduated from Meridian in 2005, she said finally. 1 year after you. I was an engineering student too, but I was in the electrical division. We wouldn't have had many overlapping classes. We didn't, Caleb said. I don't remember you from school. No reason you would. I kept a low profile. A pause. Especially in my last year. Something in how she said it, the slight weight on last year, made him pay closer attention. My family lost everything in the fall of 2004, she said. My father had a business. Import logistics, nothing dramatic. It failed. Not because he was careless, just it failed. The way things fail, sometimes all at once and without much warning. He lost the business. Then the house. Then his health went sideways because the stress of losing everything will do that to a person. And by October of that year, my mother was working double shifts at a hospital laundry facility, and I was 3 months from the end of my degree with no way to pay for any of it. She said all of this in a measured, even tone. Not without feeling. The feeling was there, compressed and controlled like something kept in a sealed container. She'd told this story before clearly. She'd learned how to carry it. I went to the financial aid office, she continued. 3 times. The 3rd time I sat in front of the counselor and I told her exactly what was happening. She was sympathetic. She was very genuinely sympathetic. And then she explained that the timelines for emergency assistance didn't align with my graduation date and there was very little they could do. She gave me a list of external scholarships I could apply for. A brief pause. The deadlines for all of them had passed. What did you do? Caleb asked. I went back to my apartment and I sat on the floor, she said. I sat on the floor for about 2 hours and I thought about calling my parents and I couldn't because what was my mother going to do? She was already working herself into the ground. And I thought about loans and I'd already exhausted what was available to me. And I thought about stopping. Just stopping. Taking a leave of absence, going home, getting a job, maybe coming back someday when things were different. But you didn't. No. She looked at him steadily. Because 3 days after I sat on that floor, I received a bank transfer. No name, no note. Just the exact amount needed to cover my remaining tuition for the final semester down to the dollar. The corridor was quiet. Somewhere behind them, the party continued, music, voices, the distant clink of glassware, but it felt very far away. The exact amount, Caleb said. To the dollar, she repeated. Which meant whoever sent it didn't guess. They knew. They'd looked it up or asked someone, or they'd done the specific work of finding out exactly what I needed. She leaned forward slightly. I went to the bank. I tried to trace it. They couldn't tell me anything beyond the originating account, which had been closed. I went to the university's financial records office and explained the situation and asked if they could tell me who had inquired about my account balance. They said they couldn't release that information. I asked everyone I knew. Nobody knew anything. She paused. Or nobody admitted to knowing anything. Caleb was quiet. I graduated, Victoria said. I got my degree. I got a job at a small tech firm in Cincinnati, then a better job in San Francisco. Then I started something of my own that failed, then something that half failed, then finally something that didn't fail at all, and kept not failing until it became what it is now. She said this without pride, or with the kind of pride that has been tempered enough by time to sound simply like fact. And the whole way through all of it, every year, every version of what I was building, I thought about that transfer. I thought about the fact that there was a person somewhere who had seen me drowning and just quietly thrown me a rope, without asking for anything, without telling anyone, just because I needed it and they could. And you wanted to find them, Caleb said. I wanted to say thank you, she said. That's all. I didn't have a plan beyond that. You don't build a $14 billion company and forget the person who made it possible. You don't do that, or at least I can't. Caleb looked at her. He looked at his hands. I thought about the fall of 2004. He thought about a Tuesday afternoon in the engineering computer lab running into a girl he barely knew. A second-year student, electrical division. Quiet, always working, the kind of student who was clearly exceptional and clearly knew it and didn't need anyone else to know it too. He thought about how she'd been sitting outside the financial aid office when he walked past, and how her face had a particular expression he recognized because he'd seen it on his own father's face once, years earlier, when the family had hit a wall they hadn't seen coming. The expression of a person doing the internal arithmetic of an impossible situation and coming up short every time. I hadn't known her. He'd seen her twice, maybe 3 times in the hallways. But he'd sat down next to her on that bench, and he'd asked if she was okay, and she'd said yes in the way that means no, and he'd asked again, and eventually she'd told him a version of it, not all of it, but enough. Enough for him to understand. He'd had savings. Not a lot, not by any objective measure, but enough. Money he'd been putting aside since his first part-time job at 16, money meant for a down payment on something someday, a future thing without a specific shape yet. He'd sat with the decision for 2 days. He'd thought about it carefully and from multiple angles, and then he'd stopped thinking and gone to the bank. He had never told anyone, not because he was ashamed of it, because it wasn't something that required telling. He'd done a thing. The thing had been the right thing. That was the end of it, or so he'd believed. It was you, Victoria said. It wasn't a question anymore. He looked up. How did you find out? I hired someone, she said simply. 3 years ago, a research firm that specializes in exactly this kind of thing. Tracing anonymous transfers, cross-referencing university financial records from that period. Narrowing down who would have had the ability and the specific knowledge of my situation to do what was done. She paused. It took them 18 months. When they came back to me with a name, I didn't believe it at first. I thought they'd made an error. Why? She looked at him directly. Because the name they gave me wasn't attached to any company, any patent, any public profile. You weren't anywhere. No LinkedIn, no business website, no articles, no awards. Just a name and a phone number and an address in a mid-sized city in Michigan. I thought they'd gotten the wrong person. But then you looked further. But then I looked further, she agreed. And the further I looked, the more I understood that I hadn't found the wrong person. I'd found the right one. I'd just been looking in the wrong places. She picked up her bag from the floor, opened it, and took out a folder. Not thin. She set it on the low table between them. Can I? Caleb asked. She nodded. He opened it. The first page was a photograph of the Halbrook Theater in Detroit. The after photograph, the one taken at the reopening with the restored marquee lit up and a crowd of people on the sidewalk out front. He knew this photograph. It had been in the Detroit Free Press. He had a copy somewhere at home in the back of a drawer because Sophie had found it once and asked him to explain it, and he'd spent an entire evening telling her the story of the theater while she sat cross-legged on the kitchen counter, eating cereal and listening with the focused, unblinking attention she gave to things she'd decided were important. Below the photograph was a 1-page summary, written in precise, clean language. The Halbrook Project, its scope, its challenges, its outcomes. The specific structural problems that had stumped 2 previous contractors and the solutions Caleb's team had engineered. The Community Impact Assessment conducted 6 months after opening. The statistic which Caleb knew, but hadn't seen written down before that attendance at community events in that neighborhood, had increased by 63% in the year following the theater's restoration. He turned the page. The Bridge Street School in Cleveland. Another photograph, another summary. A 1920s school building that had been condemned and scheduled for demolition, that Caleb and a crew of 7 had spent 8 months saving, rebuilding the foundation, preserving the original facade, converting the interior into a community learning center that now served 400 families. He remembered that project because of the cold. The worst Ohio winter in 11 years, pipes freezing overnight, showing up at 6 every morning to reassess what the cold had undone from the previous day's work. He remembered one of his crew members, a guy named Marcus, who was 23 and brand new to restoration work, asking him on a particularly brutal morning why they didn't just let the city tear it down and start fresh. Caleb had said, "Because the walls remember things, and the neighborhood needs to remember too." Marcus had looked at him for a long moment and then gone back to work without another word. He turned another page. The Morrison Street Community Housing Project. The Old Hendricks Warehouse Conversion. The Elmdale Public Library Preservation. Project after project. All of them, the kind that didn't attract much press or attracted only locally, briefly, in the community sections that most people skip. All of them, the kind that private developers routinely passed on because the profit margins were thin or non-existent. All of them, the kind that someone with Caleb's specific skill set could do and did, and then moved on from without much fanfare. "Where did you get all of this?" he asked. "The research firm, public records, some interviews with people who worked with you or knew your work." She paused. "I spoke to a woman named Linda Deering. Does that name?" "Linda runs the community board in East Side Cleveland," Caleb said. "We worked together on the Bridge Street project." "She talked about you for 40 minutes without stopping," Victoria said. "I finally had to gently interrupt her. She cried twice." Caleb closed the folder. He held it for a moment and then set it back on the table. "Victoria," he said carefully, "I appreciate what you've done here. I appreciate the effort. But I need you to understand something." He kept his voice level, direct, not unkind. "I didn't give you that money expecting to be found. I didn't do it as an investment in something. I did it because you were sitting on a bench outside a financial aid office, looking like the world had just told you a door was permanently closed, and I had the key, and it cost me something I could afford to lose. $22,000, she said. In 2004, that wasn't nothing. No, he agreed. It wasn't nothing. But it also wasn't a sacrifice. I want to be clear about that. I didn't go home and struggle because of it. It was savings. It was money I'd put aside. I decided it was better used for your degree than for something abstract in my future." He paused. "And as it turned out, I was right." "Caleb, I'm not fishing for anything," he said. "I want you to hear that plainly. I'm not sitting here wanting a check or a job offer or a press release. I just want you to understand that what I did, it didn't need to be found. It was complete on its own." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said quietly, "I know that. That's actually the reason I've been looking for you." He frowned slightly. "I'm not following." "If you'd done it hoping to be repaid," she said, "you'd have made sure I knew who you were. You'd have sent the money with your name on it, or told someone, or found a way to make sure it got back to you eventually. That's how most people operate even when they think they're being generous." She paused. "But you disappeared. You didn't just go anonymous, you stayed anonymous. For 20 years. Which means you did it purely because it needed to be done." She leaned forward slightly. "Do you know how rare that is? Do you understand what it means to me to know that someone like that exists?" Caleb didn't answer immediately. Outside the corridor, a burst of laughter from the ballroom. Someone was making a speech. He could hear the rhythm of it, the pauses for effect, the crowd responding on cue. "I have a daughter," he said finally. The shift in direction surprised her slightly. He could see it, but she followed it. "I know, Sophie. She's 9. He looked at her. "You know her name?" The research was thorough. I wasn't sure how he felt about that. He filed it under things to consider later. When Sophie was born, he said, I made a decision. Or not a decision, more like a realization. I looked at her in that hospital room, and I understood something that I hadn't understood before. That the things you do when nobody's watching, those are the things that actually define you. Not the things you do when people are applauding. Not the things you do when there's credit involved. He paused. The anonymous stuff. The quiet stuff. The things you do because they're right, not because they're useful. That's the real record. Victoria was very still. I'm not a wise man, Caleb said. I want to be clear about that too. I've made plenty of mistakes. My marriage failed. I've had projects go sideways. I've made wrong calls and bad decisions and spent more nights than I can count staring at the ceiling wondering if I'd built the right life. He paused. But that thing I did for you, that one specific thing, I've never once doubted it. Not for a single day in 20 years. The silence between them was different now. Heavier and lighter at the same time, the way silence gets when something real has been said in it. I want to ask you something, Victoria said. And I want you to hear the whole question before you answer it. All right. I'm starting a project, she said. The largest thing I've undertaken that isn't pure technology. It's a community rebuilding initiative. 7 cities starting here in Chicago, moving to Detroit, Cleveland, Pittsburgh, Baltimore, Memphis, and New Orleans. The specific focus is historic structures in distressed communities. Buildings that should be saved and aren't being saved because the financial model doesn't make it attractive for conventional developers. She paused. Sound familiar? It sounded extremely familiar. Go ahead. I've been planning this for 2 years. I've had architects, urban planners, development consultants, nonprofit strategists, all working on the framework. It's solid. The funding model works. The community partnership structure works. The only thing it's been missing. She stopped. Is someone who actually knows how to do the work? Caleb said. Is someone who actually knows how to do the work, she confirmed. Not manage it from an office, not consult on it from a distance. Someone who will stand in a condemned building in February and understand what it needs and care enough about the outcome to see it through. Caleb looked at her. She looked back. I'm not offering this to repay you, she said. I said that to you out there and I meant it. I'm not offering it because I feel guilty or obligated or because I want to clear a debt. I'm offering it because I spent 3 years finding out who you are, and everything I found told me the same thing, that you are exactly the person this project needs. What exactly are you offering? Caleb asked. Leadership, she said. Project director for the entire initiative. Full team, full budget, full authority on the ground decisions. The architects report to you. The contractors report to you. The community liaisons work with you directly. You take the framework we've built and you make it real. The number she mentioned next was not a small number. Caleb sat with it for a moment. I need you to understand something, he said. If I do this, and I'm not saying yes, I'm saying if I do it my way. The community relationships come first. The historic integrity comes first. If the budget timeline and the authentic work ever end up in conflict, I choose the authentic work. That's already written into the project charter, she said. I anticipated that condition. My daughter stays in her school. The position is mobile. You're based wherever you need to be based. I have a crew, he said. 7 people who've worked with me for years. They come with me, or I don't go. Bring them. He looked at her carefully. You anticipated all of that. I spent 3 years learning how you work, she said. I had a reasonable idea of what your conditions would be. He was quiet. From the ballroom, the speech had ended. Applause. Then music again, louder than before. Why did you come here tonight? He asked. To a 20-year university reunion. You weren't in my class. You didn't know people here. You didn't have a reason to be here unless... Someone told me you'd be here, she said simply. An alumni coordinator who remembered me from my student years. She reached out, thought I might want to reconnect with old classmates. I wasn't going to come. A pause. Then she mentioned the attendee list. I saw your name. And you came, he said. And I came, she said. Because I'd been trying to reach you through other channels for 3 months, and you don't return calls from numbers you don't recognize. Habit, he said. Apparently. He picked up the folder from the table again, held it, set it back down. Can I ask you something? He said. Yes. When you were sitting on that bench outside the financial aid office, he said, what were you thinking? She didn't answer right away. She looked at the low table between them, at the folder at her own hands. I was thinking that I'd worked for 8 years to get to where I was, she said slowly. Since I was 14, seriously working toward something. I was thinking that I'd done everything right, the grades, the applications, the scholarships, the part-time jobs, every piece of the formula, and that somehow none of it was going to be enough. That there was going to be this gap between what I'd done and what I needed that I simply couldn't bridge, and that it had nothing to do with whether I deserved it or had worked for it. A pause. I was thinking that the world had a very specific set of rules about who got to finish and who didn't, and that those rules had nothing to do with effort. And then someone changed that, Caleb said. And then someone changed that, she said. And it wasn't just the money. I want to be clear about that. It was the knowledge that someone had seen the situation and decided it wasn't acceptable. Someone had looked at those rules and decided they weren't good enough. She paused. That changed something in how I thought about everything after. About what was possible. About what one person could do when they decided to act. Caleb was quiet. I thought about his father, who had driven a delivery truck for 30 years and come home every night smelling like diesel and cardboard, and who had never once, not once, complained about it. He thought about the first building he'd ever worked on, a summer job at 17. Gutting a foreclosed duplex in his neighborhood. Just labor work. Nothing skilled. And how he'd spent the whole summer thinking about the families who'd lived in the rooms he was dismantling. He thought about the Halbrook Theater and about Marcus asking why they didn't just let it go. He thought about Linda, Deering crying in an interview with a researcher she'd never met, talking about a man who built things back up and moved on without ceremony. He thought about Sophie asleep right now in an apartment 4 hours away, probably with the light on in the hallway, because she still didn't like it. Fully dark, definitely with at least 3 books spread across her bed, because that was how she fell asleep, reading 3 things at once, and losing track of which was which. Caleb, Victoria said, I know this is a lot. I know you didn't come here tonight expecting any of this. I know you probably came here expecting... She glanced toward the ballroom with an expression that communicated her awareness of what was happening in there. Something considerably less useful. He almost smiled. That's accurate. You don't have to decide anything tonight, she said. I'm not here to pressure you. I'm here because I needed you to know that I know what you did, and because I think you're the right person for this work, and because... She stopped. Started again more carefully. Because the man who quietly paid for a stranger's future 20 years ago deserves to know that the future turned into something worth paying for. The sentence landed somewhere in his chest and stayed there. He didn't speak for a moment. Then he said, She's a good kid. Victoria looked at him. Sophie, he said. She's a really good kid. That's the main thing. Whatever I've done right or wrong, whatever got built or didn't get built, whatever I walked away from or toward. She's a good kid who knows how to be kind and works hard and still thinks the best thing in the world is finding a really excellent library book. He paused. I think I did okay. Victoria's expression shifted. Something in it became very quiet, very still. You did better than okay, she said. He nodded slowly. Once. Outside in the ballroom, the music shifted, something older, slower, the kind of song that gets played at a reunion specifically to make people feel the weight of 20 years passing. Caleb could hear people moving to the edge of the floor. Could hear voices getting softer and more careful, the way voices do when a song makes you suddenly aware of time. He stood up. Victoria stood too. I'll call you, he said. I have your number. You don't, she said. But you will. She reached into the folder and took out a single card, plain small, just a name and a number, nothing else. She held it out. He took it. He looked at it for a moment, then put it in the pocket of the worn jacket that Richard Holt had laughed at 3 hours ago. One more question, he said. Yes. Did you always know it was going to be this complicated to say thank you? She looked at him for a moment. Then something broke open in her expression, not the composure she'd been holding carefully in place, but through it behind it, the face of someone who had been 22 years old and sitting on a bench outside a financial aid office, doing the arithmetic of an impossible situation. Yes, she said. Then why did you do it anyway? She smiled. Not the measured public smile he'd seen her use in the ballroom. Something smaller and more real. Because someone I never expected taught me that doing the right thing doesn't require it to be simple, she said. It just requires you to decide. He held her gaze for one more moment. Then he nodded and walked back toward the ballroom, where Richard Holt was standing near the bar, watching the corridor entrance, with an expression he was working very hard to make look casual and failing, and where 200 people who had spent the evening measuring success by every visible and purchasable marker were waiting without knowing they were waiting for the thing that was about to walk back into the room. The card sat in his pocket. He didn't touch it again. He didn't need to. Caleb walked back into the ballroom, and the first thing he noticed was that the room had rearranged itself around his absence, not physically. The tables were where they'd been. The bar was where it had been. The stage, with its cycling slideshow of old campus photographs, was exactly where it had been all evening. But the social geometry of the space had shifted. The clusters of people had reformed themselves, and almost every cluster was angled, some subtly, some not subtly at all, toward the corridor entrance where Caleb had just appeared. I was aware of the attention, the way you're aware of weather. Not alarmed by it, just noting it. Richard Holt was still near the bar. Caleb had been right about that. Richard was holding a drink he hadn't touched in a while, judging by the condensation ring on his palm, and he was talking to Danny Prescott. And both of them were doing the thing people do when they're pretending not to watch something while watching it. The slight angle of the body away from the subject. The eyes that move in short controlled arcs. The conversation that keeps starting and stopping because neither participant is actually paying attention to it. Caleb walked to the bar. He ordered water again. The bartender, young, efficient, slightly bored in the way of someone who has worked 100 events exactly like this one, set the glass down without ceremony. Whitmore. He turned. Richard was there. Danny a half step behind him, which was where Danny had always been in college, and apparently in life half a step behind Richard, the loyal audience of a one-man performance. Richard's face was doing something complicated. The easy confidence from earlier had developed a fault line, not collapsed. Richard was not the kind of man who collapsed easily, but cracked slightly, and the crack was visible if you knew what to look for. You and Victoria Harrington, Richard said, stating it, testing how it sounded out loud. Yes, Caleb said. You know her. I know her now. Richard looked at him with that particular expression of a man trying to reassemble a picture that doesn't fit the frame he'd already built for it. From where? How does someone like you? He stopped, seemed to hear himself. How do you two know each other? She went to school here, Caleb said. Year after us. I know that. She's worth... Richard stopped again. He was doing the math visibly, and the math was humiliating him, and he knew it, and knowing it made him angrier than the math itself. She barely spoke to anyone in there. She walked past me like I was furniture, and then she... He gestured vaguely toward the corridor. Went and talked to me, Caleb said. Yeah. A pause. Yeah, Richard, Caleb said. Not unkindly. He genuinely wasn't angry. He was past angry, or he'd never arrived at it in the first place. He'd been somewhere cooler and quieter all evening, and he was still there. I think you've got a lot of things you want to say to me right now, and I think most of them are really questions about yourself. So I'm going to save us both some time. Richard's jaw tightened. What you said to me earlier, Caleb continued, about some people building on the foundation, and some people just maintaining, you were wrong. Not mean, or not only mean. Just wrong. There's a difference. He picked up his water. I'm not going to explain myself to you. I never needed to. But I'll tell you this, the day you learn to ask someone a real question before you decide what their answer is, you're going to find out that you've been missing a lot. He took a drink. Danny Prescott, to his credit, was looking at the floor with the expression of a man who had recently become aware that he'd picked the wrong side of something. Richard didn't answer. He wasn't equipped to right now. The crack in his confidence had widened, and whatever was going to come out of it wasn't going to be anything he'd want a room full of people to hear. Caleb set down his glass and walked away from the bar. He found a table that had emptied out near the edge of the room and sat down for the first time all evening. His feet were tired. That was the pedestrian truth of it. He'd been standing for 3 hours. He was 35, and his feet hurt in the boots he'd chosen because they were his best ones, not because they were comfortable. He sat and watched the room. And the room watched him back, trying to pretend it wasn't. A woman he didn't recognize approached the table. 50s maybe. Silver hair pulled back cleanly. She hadn't been there all evening, or he hadn't noticed her, which meant she'd either arrived late or occupied a part of the room he hadn't looked at. She moved without the social performance quality. Most people in this room were operating with the ease of someone who had stopped needing things from strangers a long time ago. "May I?" She gestured at the chair across from him. "Please," he said. She sat, looked at him directly. "You're Caleb Whitmore." "That seems to be common knowledge tonight," he said. Something shifted in her expression, not quite amusement, but close. "My name is Eleanor Marsh. I was on the faculty here for 18 years, Structural Engineering Department. I retired in 2019. He looked at her more carefully. "Eleanor Marsh, I had a seminar with you, fall of 2002. Materials and load distribution," she said. 16 students. You sat in the third row and never once asked a question in class and wrote the highest scoring final paper I received that year. He hadn't expected that. "You remember that. I remember every paper that surprises me," she said. "You wrote about adaptive reuse of historical structures. In 2002. Before it was really a conversation anyone was having seriously. You argued that the structural integrity of older buildings was routinely underestimated because engineers were applying contemporary load models to materials that behaved differently. That if you approached restoration with the same rigor as new construction, but adapted the methodology to the specific material properties, you could save buildings that were being condemned unnecessarily. She paused. You were 20 years ahead of the field. Caleb looked at her. "I wanted to find you after that paper," she said. "I had 3 colleagues I was going to show it to. Then you graduated, and I lost track." She paused. "I've seen your work, though. The Halbrook, the Bridge Street School." "How did you—" "I consult for a historical preservation nonprofit based out of Cincinnati," she said. "We evaluated both projects as case studies. Your structural solutions on the Halbrook Foundation were—" She paused, choosing the word. "Elegant. Not a term I use often in engineering contexts, but elegant is the right word." Caleb was quiet for a moment. He felt something that he didn't have a clean name for, not pride exactly, but something adjacent to it. The feeling of being seen accurately, which is different from being praised and considerably rarer. "Dr. Marsh," he said, "can I ask why you came tonight? You didn't seem like a person who was here for the party." She smiled. Small, clear, honest. "I wasn't. I come every 5 years. I walk through, I find 2 or 3 former students who ended up doing interesting things, and I tell them what I see in their work, because nobody told me when I was their age, and it would have meant a great deal if someone had." She paused. "You were on my list tonight." He looked at her. "You're the only one on the list who didn't seek me out first," she said. "Everyone else comes and finds the faculty. You came clearly wanted to leave, almost left several times, and then ended up in a private conversation with Victoria Harrington in a corridor." She tilted her head slightly. "Which tells me you're either very impressive or very lucky." "Or both," he said. "Yes," she said. "Or both." He thought about the card in his pocket. Thought about the folder Victoria had shown him, project after project documented by someone who'd cared enough to look. Thought about Linda Deering apparently crying in an interview. Thought about Marcus, who now ran his own small restoration crew out of Columbus, and still called Caleb twice a year, once on his birthday, and once on the anniversary of the day they finished the Halbrook. "Dr. Marsh," he said, "can I ask you something?" "Of course." "When I was your student," he said, If you'd known then the trajectory, I mean, the path. Not the big projects, not the ones anyone would write about. The quiet ones. The buildings that don't make papers. The 18-hour days in a condemned school in a Cleveland winter. Would you have told me to choose differently? More visibility, more recognition, more conventional success. She looked at him for a long moment. Really looked the way that professor had always looked, like she was evaluating the load-bearing capacity of the person in front of her. No, she said. I would have told you to do exactly what you did. Exactly. A pause. Prestige is for people who need external confirmation that their work matters. Work that matters doesn't require that confirmation. She paused again. The buildings you've saved will still be standing when everyone in this room has been forgotten. He sat with that for a moment. Then his phone buzzed. He looked at it automatically, a reflex, and saw Sophie's name on the screen. Dad. I know it's late, but I can't sleep, and I want to know how the party is. Is it good, or is it weird? It sounds like it would be weird. He typed back. It started weird. It got interesting. A pause. Then, interesting how? Tell me everything. I'm awake, I promise. He looked at the phone, looked at Dr. Marsh, who was watching him with the expression of someone who understood exactly what they were seeing without needing it explained. My daughter, he said. How old? 9. What's she like? He thought about it honestly. She reads everything she can get her hands on. She has opinions about architecture, which is my fault. She corrected a contractor who came to do work on our building, once pointed out that he'd described a structural support incorrectly, and he spent 10 minutes trying to explain to a 9-year-old why she was wrong before giving up. He paused. She was right. Dr. Marsh looked at him steadily. She sounds like someone who's been raised by someone who takes ideas seriously. I try, he said. You do more than try, she said. That quality, taking ideas seriously, treating knowledge as something to pursue rather than something to perform. It doesn't appear in a 9-year-old without consistent modeling. That's your work too, Caleb. That's also the kind of building that lasts. He felt that land somewhere real. He typed back to Sophie. Party is almost over. I'll tell you everything tomorrow. Her reply. You always say that, and then you summarize. I want the full story, Dad. Full story, he typed. I promise. Even the parts that surprised you. He paused. Especially those he typed. He put his phone away. Dr. Marsh stood. I won't keep you. I only wanted to tell you what I see. She extended her hand. Keep doing the work, Caleb. Not for the recognition, not for the money, for the buildings, for the communities, and for whatever 9-year-old is going to grow up knowing that the world can be put back together by someone who cares enough to try. He shook her hand. She walked away without looking back. He sat alone at the table, and for a moment, the party noise fell away from him, and he was just a man sitting quietly in a room where everything had shifted in the last 2 hours, feeling the particular weight of an evening that had turned out to be something completely different from what he'd expected. Then the seat across from him was occupied again, and he looked up. It was Gretchen, the woman from the economics class who'd stopped by earlier. She sat down without asking, which was different from the first time when she'd approached him with that social checklist energy. She sat down, and she looked like someone who had been thinking for the last hour and had arrived at something uncomfortable. Can I just, she started. Stopped. Can I say something honestly? Sure, he said. When I talked to you earlier, she said, I was awful. You weren't awful, he said. You were just, I was doing the thing where I was measuring you, she said. In about 60 seconds I decided what your life amounted to, and then I went back to my husband and I said... She stopped, shook her head. I'm not going to tell you what I said because it's embarrassing, but I want you to know that I saw what happened tonight, with Victoria Harrington. And I know what actually happened, what was actually said, but... A pause. But whatever it was, it made me feel like I'd been doing something wrong for a long time. Caleb looked at her. What do you think you've been doing wrong? She considered that. Genuinely, it seemed. Deciding things too fast. Deciding what someone is worth before I've actually looked. She paused. I have 3 kids, 2 boys and a girl. And I was sitting here thinking about what I was going to tell my daughter about tonight, and I realized I'd been modeling exactly what I don't want her to do. Caleb was quiet. I know that's not your problem, Gretchen said. You don't owe me anything. I just needed to say it to someone. Why to me? She looked at him steadily. Because you're the person I did it to. He nodded slowly. What's your daughter's name? She blinked. Audrey. She's 14. What does she want to do when she's older? Gretchen paused. Something in the question caught her off guard. She wants to be an architect. She's been talking about it since she was 8. She'd have a lot to say to you. She's obsessed with old buildings. A pause. We drove past this old theater in the area last year that was being restored, and she made me stop the car. We just stood there on the sidewalk while she looked at it. I didn't even understand what she was seeing, but she was transfixed. What theater? Caleb asked. Gretchen frowned, remembering. I can't remember the name. It was in the South Side. Old marquee ornate facade they were. They were in the middle of the restoration. There was scaffolding. Audrey said she could see what it was going to look like when it was finished, and she described it. And about 4 months later, we drove past again, and it was exactly... She stopped, looked at him. Wait. Caleb said nothing. Was that The Palmer Street Theater, Caleb said. We finished it 8 months ago. Gretchen stared at him. The original plasterwork on the ceiling was the hardest part, he said. It had been painted over 6 times. We spent 3 weeks just uncovering what was underneath. He paused. The ornate work on the facade, your daughter saw that correctly. That was what it was always meant to look like. We just had to take off everything that had been covering it. Gretchen was very still. Then she said in a voice that had lost all its social polish. She cried when she saw the finished building. She called me into her room and she said, Mom, someone cared enough. That's what she said. Someone cared enough. And she stopped. Her voice had changed again. Smaller. She said she wanted to be that person someday. The one who cares enough. Caleb looked at her for a long moment. Tell her she already is, he said. The fact that she sees what a building was meant to look like before the restoration is finished, that's not learned. That's a quality that's already there. Tell her to follow it. Gretchen looked at him with an expression he recognized. The same expression Marcus had when Caleb had said the walls remember things. The expression of someone who has just been handed a sentence they're going to carry for a long time. Thank you, she said quietly. He nodded. She stood, looked like she might say something else, then didn't. Walked back toward her husband, who was watching from across the room with an expression of mild confusion at whoever his wife had just been talking to. Caleb watched her go. Then he looked up and found with no particular surprise that Richard Holt was standing at his table again. This time, Danny Prescott wasn't with him. This time, Richard was alone, and he was holding a glass of something amber with both hands, and he looked like a man who had spent the last 30 minutes arguing with himself and wasn't sure who'd won. Can I sit? Richard asked. Caleb looked at him for a moment. Sure. Richard sat, didn't speak right away, turned the glass in his hands. I owe you an apology, he said finally. The words came out with the effortful quality of something that hadn't been said much. In the same way a muscle that hasn't been used feels stiff and uncertain of itself. Caleb waited. What I said earlier, the grab, all of it. Richard's jaw moved. I was being a jerk. I was being the specific kind of jerk that I'm kind of... A pause. That I'm aware I am, sometimes. And I just... He stopped. Richard, Caleb said. You don't have to do this because you saw me talking to a billionaire. The words landed hard. Richard flinched slightly. I'm not, Richard said. Then, or it started that way. I'll be honest, it started that way. I saw you walk back in and I thought... He stopped. Started again. I've built my whole life on a very specific understanding of how things work. Who matters? Who doesn't? How you can tell the difference in 60 seconds or less. And tonight, he looked at his glass. Tonight that framework got, I don't know, challenged. By what? By the fact that someone like Victoria Harrington doesn't walk across a room full of people like that for no reason, Richard said. She didn't walk across it to me. She didn't walk across it to anyone here I'd have predicted. She walked across it to you. And I've been sitting here trying to understand what I missed, and the honest answer is... He paused. The honest answer is, I didn't look. Caleb studied him. Richard Holt was not a person who found this easy. The admission was real, whatever had pushed him to it. You've been doing this a long time, Caleb said. The quick assessment, the social calculation. It works for you mostly. In the circles you operate in, it probably works 90% of the time. Yeah, Richard said. The 10% you miss, Caleb said, is not a rounding error. It's the part that matters. Richard was quiet. I'm not angry at you, Caleb said. I want to be clear about that. I know that might be hard to believe, but I genuinely am not sitting here holding a grudge about tonight. I've been grabbed by better men than you and ignored by worse ones, and I'm still here, and my life is what I decided it was going to be. He paused. But if you want the apology to mean something, don't give it to me. Go home and think about where else you've done this. That's where the work is. Richard looked at him across the table. For a long moment, the pretense was gone. The curated, successful, 60-second assessment version of Richard Holt was gone, and what was left was a man in his mid-30s sitting across from someone he'd misjudged, trying to figure out what that meant about the way he'd been living. You know what the worst part is, Richard said. What? I did it to you in about 10 seconds, he said. 10 seconds, and I've been doing it to people for 20 years, which means... He stopped. Which means there are people you've written off who probably deserved better, Caleb said. Richard didn't answer. He didn't need to. Richard. Caleb leaned forward slightly. The fact that it bothers you tonight is the thing. Most people never get even that far. Most people have an evening like this, and by tomorrow they've constructed a story about why they were actually right. He paused. You're still here sitting at my table with your glass saying it out loud. That means something. Richard looked at him with an expression that was complicated and genuine, and slightly disorienting on a face that had been performing confidence all evening. You're an interesting person, Whitmore, he said quietly. You would have known that, Caleb said, if you'd asked. Richard almost smiled. It didn't quite form, but it came close. He stood up, straightened his jacket, the reflex of a man who has certain gestures so deeply embedded they operate independently, and looked at Caleb one more time. For what it's worth, he said. I hope you take whatever it is she's offering. I don't know what it is, but I hope you take it. He walked away. Caleb sat alone at the table for a few minutes. The party had shifted into its later phase, the part of the evening where the social effort has peaked and people are either deeply comfortable with whoever they've ended up next to or quietly planning their exit. The music was still playing. A few couples had found their way to the small dance floor near the stage. The bar was doing steady business. He thought about the card in his pocket. I thought about 7 cities. About condemned buildings in distressed neighborhoods. About the specific kind of work he'd been doing alone in smaller pockets with a crew of 7 people who drove old trucks and worked long hours and sent him photographs of completed projects with simple texts that just said, "Look at this," or "We did it," or sometimes just a string of exclamation marks that required no interpretation. I thought about doing that at scale. About what it would mean for those neighborhoods, not one building at a time, not one city at a time, but a systematic, resourced, committed attempt to do the thing he'd been doing quietly for 10 years, but with the capacity to do it at a level that could actually shift something structural about how communities lost and reclaimed themselves. He thought about Sophie, who had told him that someone cared enough, who had sat on a kitchen counter eating cereal while he told her the story of the Halbrook Theater and asked him at the end why he hadn't wanted anyone to know about it. He'd told her, because the building is the point, not me. She'd thought about that for a long time, long enough that he'd thought she'd moved on to something else in her head, and then she'd said, "But if people know you did it, other people might want to do it too. So maybe sometimes the point and the person are both the point." She'd been 7 years old. He had not had a satisfying answer to that. He still didn't. His phone buzzed again. He expected Sophie, but the number on the screen wasn't hers. It was a number he didn't recognize. He answered. "Caleb." Victoria's voice. calm, direct. "I know this is soon. I just wanted to say one more thing before tonight is really over." "All right," he said. "I've made a lot of decisions in my life by thinking through every angle," she said. "By running projections, consulting advisors, stress testing assumptions. And those decisions have mostly been good ones. But the best decision I've ever been part of was made by a 20-year-old kid in a bank line who ran the math in his head and then stopped running it and just did the right thing." He was quiet. "I'm not asking you to stop thinking," she said. "I'm just asking you to remember that sometimes you already know." The line went quiet. Then she said, "Good night, Caleb." "Good night," he said. He hung up. He sat there with the phone in his hand, in a ballroom full of people who had spent 20 years becoming exactly what they'd intended to become. And he thought about a 22-year-old girl sitting on a bench outside a financial aid office doing the arithmetic of an impossible situation. He thought about what it felt like to be the thing that changed the arithmetic. He thought about 7 cities. He thought about Sophie asleep 4 hours north of here with the hallway light on. I thought about what she'd said at 7 years old, which was still the clearest thing anyone had ever said to him about the work. Maybe sometimes the point and the person are both the point. He stood up. He walked to the coat check, collected his jacket, said goodnight to the attendant who was the only person in the building who seemed entirely unburdened by the evening. He pushed through the lobby doors into the cool September air. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment in the dark, and the relative quiet 3 blocks from a truck that had 400,000 miles on it, and a child's drawing rubber-banded to the passenger sun visor, because Sophie had given it to him 6 months ago and told him it was road trip protection. He reached into his jacket pocket. He took out the card. He looked at it. He put it back. He started walking. I had a 4-hour drive and a daughter who wanted the full story, every detail, even the boring parts, especially the surprising ones, and he was going to have to figure out how to tell her all of it in a way that made sense. He thought maybe it would make sense. I thought maybe that was the right word for an evening like this one. An evening where a room full of people who thought they knew exactly what everything was worth had been shown quietly and without argument that they'd been measuring the wrong things all along. I thought about the buildings he'd saved, the walls that remembered, the theaters that opened their doors again on neighborhoods that needed something to come back to. He thought about the school in Cleveland and the warehouse in Pittsburgh and the library in Elmdale, where a woman named Ruth had written him a letter, handwritten 3 pages. The ink slightly smeared in places, telling him that her mother had borrowed her first book from that library 60 years ago, and that now her own granddaughter had borrowed her first book from the same building, from the same shelf system, because Caleb and his crew had preserved the original millwork down to the shelf brackets. 3 generations, she'd written. You gave us 3 generations back. He'd kept that letter. Kept it in the same drawer where he kept the newspaper photograph from the Halbrook opening. Kept it the way you keep things that remind you what the work is actually for. He reached his truck. He sat behind the wheel for a moment without starting it. He took out the card again. 1 name, 1 number. I thought about what it would mean to say yes. To take a thing he'd been doing alone and small and quiet and bring it into the light, into scale, into the kind of work that would get written about and talked about and photographed. To become the person other people could see doing it, which was exactly what he'd always been careful not to be. He thought about Sophie at 7 years old. Maybe sometimes the point and the person are both the point. He turned the card over in his hands. He set it on the dashboard. He started the truck. He had 4 hours. That was enough time to think. And somewhere in those 4 hours in the dark and the quiet of an empty interstate at midnight, in the particular kind of clarity that comes only when everything else has gone away, and there's nothing left but the road ahead, and the reason you're on it somewhere in there. He was going to figure out what he was going to do. He already knew what he was going to do, but he needed the 4 hours to catch up to the knowing. He pulled out of the parking space. He drove. I was 40 minutes outside Chicago when he called Marcus. It was past midnight. Marcus answered on the second ring, which meant he'd been awake, which meant either the Cleveland project he was managing had hit a problem, or his wife had had the baby early, or both. And Caleb's first words were, "Everything okay?" before Marcus could say anything beyond hello. Yeah, all good, Marcus said. His voice had that particular texture of someone who'd been watching television in the dark while pretending to be relaxed. Simone's fine. Baby's not for 3 more weeks. I was just up. A pause. How was the reunion? Strange, Caleb said. Strange how? Caleb thought about how to compress the evening into something that fit a phone call at midnight on an empty interstate. He thought about Richard's hand grabbing his sleeve. He thought about Victoria walking across a silent ballroom. He thought about Eleanor Marsh saying elegant the way engineers almost never use the word. He thought about Gretchen's daughter standing on a sidewalk, describing a finished building she hadn't seen yet. Victoria Harrington was there, he said. A pause. Victoria Harrington, Marcus repeated. Not a question. The kind of repetition that means someone is deciding how seriously to take what they just heard. She wants me to lead a project, Caleb said. 7 cities. Historic restoration in distressed communities. Full team, full budget. The silence on Marcus's end was longer this time. Caleb knew this silence. He'd heard it on job sites when he told his crew something that required them to recalibrate the silence of people who are intelligent enough to understand the weight of information before they react to it. Full budget meaning what? Marcus said finally. Meaning not our budget, Caleb said. Meaning a real budget. The kind where the problem isn't whether we can afford to do the work right, but whether we can find enough people who know how to do it. Another pause. You serious right now? Yeah. Caleb. Marcus's voice shifted. The television in the dark relaxation was entirely gone. That's how long have we talked about what we could do if the money wasn't the ceiling? How many times have we stood in front of a building and I've said, I know, Caleb said, and you're calling me at midnight on the highway, which means you haven't said yes yet, Marcus said. Which means something is stopping you. So what's stopping you? Caleb watched the road. The headlights pushing into the dark ahead of him, illuminating 100 feet at a time and no more. He'd always found something honest about driving at night. You couldn't see further than your lights reached, and you had to trust that the road was still there beyond them, and mostly it was. Nothing rational, he said. Then what? I thought about how to say it. I've spent 10 years building something quiet, he said. The work is quiet. The crew is small. I know every job from the inside because I'm standing inside it every day. If this thing becomes what she's describing. He paused. I'm not inside it anymore. I'm above it. I'm managing it. I'm the person in the meeting instead of the person on the floor. Caleb, Marcus said. Can I tell you something? That's why I called you. The Hallbrook, Marcus said. The Bridge Street School. The Palmer Street Theater. Those 3 projects alone changed things for the people in those neighborhoods in ways that... He stopped. Started again. There are kids in East right now doing after-school programs in the Hallbrook lobby. Every Tuesday and Thursday. I know this because Linda Deering sends me pictures sometimes because she knows I worked on it, and she wants us to see what it turned into. A pause. We did 4 buildings in 10 years, man. 4 major ones. With our budget. With our timeline, with our ceiling. He paused. She's talking about 7 cities. How many buildings is that? How many lobbies? How many Tuesday afternoons? Caleb didn't answer. You've been the person on the floor, Marcus said. For 10 years. You know what the floor looks like. You know what the walls need. Nobody's going to take that away from you by giving you more resources to work with. A pause. Being above it doesn't mean leaving it. It means you can see more of it at once. Caleb drove. The road continued ahead of him, lit and dark in equal measure. Your crew comes with you, Marcus said. It wasn't a question. She said yes to that already. Then what are we talking about? Marcus said. Not unkindly, just accurately. I don't know, Caleb admitted. I've been asking myself that for 2 hours. You know what I think, Marcus said. Tell me. I think you spent so long choosing the quiet thing because the quiet thing was right that you started to think the quiet thing was always going to be right, Marcus said. And now something loud is in front of you, and you're treating the loudness like a warning sign when it might just be what it is. A pause. Bigger. Caleb thought about that. I thought about Dr. Marsh saying the buildings you've saved will still be standing when everyone in this room has been forgotten. He thought about what that meant multiplied across 7 cities. He thought about how many buildings were being condemned right now in neighborhoods across this country this week, this month, because the financial model didn't support their survival, and there was nobody in the room arguing for them with both the knowledge of what they were worth and the resources to act on that knowledge. I thought about being that person in the room. "Marcus," he said, "if I do this, you're with me. You and the crew. New title, better pay. I'm not going without you." Another silence. Different quality this time. "Simone's gonna lose her mind," Marcus said quietly. "In the good way." Caleb almost smiled. "Get some sleep. I'll call you this week." "Caleb." Marcus's voice dropped. "You already know what you're going to do." "Yeah," Caleb said. "So why are you still driving around thinking about it?" "Because Sophie's asleep, and I need something to do for 4 hours." Marcus laughed. It was a full, real laugh, the kind that doesn't have any performance in it. "All right, man. Drive safe." "Night," Caleb said. He hung up. He drove for another 20 minutes in silence, and then he passed the sign for the rest area at mile marker 91, and he pulled off without planning to. He parked, turned off the engine, sat in the dark and the quiet. He reached for the card on the dashboard. He turned it over in his hands, the way he'd been turning it over all evening, not anxiously, just thinking through it, the way he turned problems over when he was working. When he stood in front of a building that needed saving, he didn't stand there anxiously. He stood there, and he looked at it, and he let what he knew accumulate until the right answer became obvious. He'd learned that process over years, standing in front of condemned structures that other people had written off, learning to read what they needed rather than what seemed easiest. He looked at the card. Victoria Harrington. 1 number. He thought about what she'd said on the phone. Sometimes you already know. I thought about his father, who had driven a truck for 30 years and been good at it, and come home every night and been a decent man and a present father, and had never once, as far as Caleb knew, regretted the quietness of the life he'd built. But he'd also told Caleb once when Caleb was about 16 and asking about ambition in the way teenagers ask about things they don't fully understand. Yet he'd said, "The mistake people make is thinking that choosing a big thing means abandoning the small ones. The real question is whether the big thing serves the same values as the small thing. If it does, it's not really a different choice. It's just a larger version of the same one." Caleb had been 16. He'd filed it away without fully understanding it. He understood it now. He put the card back on the dashboard. He started the truck. He drove the rest of the way home. He pulled into his parking space at 2:47 in the morning. The building was quiet. The hallway light was on when he got upstairs. Not the apartment hallway light. The light inside the apartment visible under the front door, which meant Sophie had left the kitchen light on for him, which she'd started doing when she was 7. Without ever explaining it, just began doing it one night when he'd come home late from a project, and it had been there ever since. He unlocked the door quietly. The kitchen light was on. The living room was dark. There were, as predicted, 3 books spread across the couch in positions that suggested someone had been reading all of them and fallen asleep mid-rotation. He checked on Sophie. She was asleep in this position she always slept on her side. One arm under the pillow, the other stretched across the mattress, reaching for something that wasn't there. She had her mother's hair and Caleb's stubborn jaw, and an expression in sleep that was completely her own. Not peaceful exactly, more like concentrated. Even asleep, she looked like she was working something out. He stood in the doorway for a moment. Then he went to the kitchen, drank a glass of water standing at the sink, and sat down at the table. He pulled out the card. He set it on the table in front of him. He looked at it for a long time. Then he picked up his phone and typed a message to Victoria's number. He wasn't sure why he did it by text instead of planning to call in the morning. It felt more honest, somehow, less performed. "I have conditions," he typed. "Not the ones I mentioned tonight. Different ones." He looked at the screen. Then he typed, The communities have to be partners, not recipients. Not consultation. Actual partnership, meaning they have real decision-making authority on what gets restored and how. If that's negotiable in the project charter, I can't be the person you need. He set the phone down. He didn't expect a reply at 3 in the morning. The reply came in 4 minutes. Already in the charter. Article 7 Community Partnership Framework. It was the first thing I wrote. He looked at the screen, then he typed, "Then I'm in." He put the phone face down on the table. He sat in the quiet kitchen in the middle of the night with the kitchen light, his daughter left on for him, and the books scattered on the couch, and the drawings on the refrigerator. And he thought that this was what it felt like when a thing you'd been building alone for a long time made contact with something larger than itself. Not a collision. Not an intrusion. More like connection. The way two load-bearing structures properly aligned become stronger together than either is alone. He turned off the kitchen light and went to bed. He slept well, which surprised him slightly. He'd expected the kind of night where thoughts circle and sleep stays just out of reach. But he was out almost immediately, and he didn't dream or didn't remember dreaming. And when he woke up, it was to the sound of someone in the kitchen and the smell of something burning. He was out of bed before he was fully awake. Sophie was standing at the stove with a look of intense concentration and a pan that contained what had once been eggs and was now approaching something more geological. "I'm making breakfast," she said without turning around. "Don't panic." "I'm not panicking," he said. "I'm assessing." "That's just panicking with better vocabulary." He stood beside her, looked at the pan, looked at her. "Can I help?" "No, I watched a video. It's a technique." "What technique involves eggs being that color?" "It's caramelized." "Eggs don't caramelize, Soph. These ones did." She turned to look at him. Her hair was half in a ponytail and half refusing the ponytail in the way it always did, and she was wearing the oversized Halbrook Theater t-shirt that Linda Deering had sent them after the opening extra large, obviously meant for an adult, which Sophie wore as a dress and refused to give up. She studied his face with the focused attention she applied to most things. "You look different," she said. "I drove 4 hours and slept 4 hours. No, not tired, different. Different. She turned back to the eggs with the decisive air of someone who has noted something and filed it for later. "Tell me everything." He sat down at the kitchen table. He'd been at this table a few hours ago looking at the card. The card was still there. He moved it slightly to the side without drawing attention to it. He told her, not everything at once. He circled through it, the way he'd circled through the drive home, finding the shape of the evening in the telling. He told her about arriving and the check-in table and Richard Holt's hand on his sleeve. He told her about the display boards with the old photographs. He told her about Dr. Marsh and her memory of a paper he'd written 22 years ago. He told her about Victoria walking across the ballroom and the corridor and the folder and the conversation. Sophie listened, the way she always listened to things she cared about completely. Not performing attention, actually giving it. The eggs got progressively more geological, and she didn't appear to notice. "She knew who you were," Sophie said, "for 3 years, and she couldn't find you." "I'm not hard to find," Caleb said. "You kind of are, though," Sophie said. "You don't have a website, your phone number's not online, you're basically invisible on purpose." "Not on purpose," he said. "Just I never needed to be findable. Until now." Sophie turned off the burner. She looked at the pan for a moment, with the critical honesty of someone evaluating their own work. "These are beyond caramelized," she said. "There's cereal. There's always cereal." She got the box down from the cabinet, got 2 bowls poured without measuring, brought them to the table, sat across from him, poured milk, pushed his bowl toward him. All of this in one fluid sequence that had the feel of something done so many times it had become its own kind of language. "So what did you tell her?" she asked. "I told her I needed to think about it." Sophie looked at him with the expression she used when she thought he was being imprecise. "What does that mean?" "You thought about it on the drive home. You called Marcus. You probably sat in that rest area off the highway you always stop at." She pointed her spoon at him. "You always stop at that rest area when you're working something out." He looked at her. How do you know about that rest area? Dad, I've driven with you approximately 1 million times. You stop there when something's in your head. She ate a spoonful of cereal. So what did you actually decide? He looked at the card on the table. He slid it across to her. She picked it up, read it, turned it over, set it down. Victoria Harrington, she said. Yeah. She's the one who... Sophie stopped, started again. The Harrington tech person. Yeah. The one from school, whose tuition you paid. He looked at her. How do you know about that? Sophie met his eyes with an expression that was very still and very honest. I found the bank records, she said. Last year, I was looking for the folder with our lease papers, and I found the wrong folder. He was quiet. I didn't say anything because you didn't say anything, she said. I figured you'd tell me when you wanted to. She paused. You never did. Sophie, I'm not mad, she said quickly. I want you to know that I knew, that I've known for a year. She looked at the card on the table. And now she found you, and she wants you to do the thing you do, but bigger. She paused. Right. Yeah, he said. 7 cities. Community restoration. Full team real resources. Sophie was quiet for a moment, eating her cereal, looking at the table, running something through in her head in the particular way she did slowly, thoroughly, without apparent hurry. Are you scared? She asked. He thought about that honestly. Not scared, he said. More like aware. That it changes something. That the version of the work I've been doing is one thing, and the version she's describing is a different thing. And even if they're built on the same values, they're not the same experience. Yeah, Sophie said. But Dad... She looked at him directly, and there were moments like this where he was absolutely floored by her, by the clarity of her thinking, by the precision of it, by the fact that she was 9 years old and sitting across from him in an oversized t-shirt, eating cereal at 8 in the morning and saying things that were more useful than half the conversations he'd had with adults last night. How many buildings have you saved, like for real? The real number, he thought. 37 significant projects, he said, over 10 years. And how many people live in those neighborhoods? I've never counted. I have, she said. He stared at her. I looked it up, she said with the faint defensive edge of someone expecting to be told they overstepped. Last fall, for a school project, about community impact of historic preservation. I used your projects as the case studies. A pause. My teacher thought I made up the numbers. I didn't know what to say. He sat there looking at his daughter across a kitchen table at 8 in the morning, and he didn't know what to say. There are approximately 42,000 people in the neighborhoods where you've worked, she said. That we know of. That's the ones I could count. And those are just the residents, not the people who use the buildings for programs and events and stuff. She paused. 42,000 people. And you did that with your crew and your budget and your way of working. She looked at the card. Multiply it. He looked at her. She looked at him. I already texted her, he said quietly. Last night. I said yes. Sophie's expression did something complicated, surprise and not surprise happening at the same time. What conditions? She asked, because she knew him. Community partnership has real authority, he said. Not consultation. Real decision-making power. Sophie nodded, slowly. Good condition. She said it was already in the charter. Good. Sophie picked up her spoon, resumed eating, as if that settled it because as far as she was concerned it did. They ate in silence for a moment. The morning light came through the kitchen window. One of Sophie's drawings was on the refrigerator directly in Caleb's sightline. A building, of course, rendered in colored pencil with more structural accuracy than most adults would manage with tiny figures standing in front of it that she'd labeled in her careful handwriting. He'd asked her once who the figures were. She'd said, people coming back. He thought about that now. People coming back. Soph, he said. Yeah. The project means travel, more than I've been doing. She looked up. How much more? I'm not sure yet, but more. For stretches. He watched her face. I need you to tell me honestly if that's... Dad. She set her spoon down. I've been going on job sites since I was 4. I did homework in the truck outside the Halbrook for an entire fall. I know how to travel, and I know how to adapt, and I have 2 sets of school clothes at Grandma's in case I need to stay there. She paused. I'm not fragile. I know you're not, he said. And anyway, she said, it's not like you're leaving. You're going to do the work, and then coming home. That's what you always do. She looked at him steadily. You always come home. He felt that in a way that made his chest tight. Yeah, he said. I do. She picked her spoon back up. Can I come to one of the cities when you're there? Which one? New Orleans, she said immediately, without hesitation. I've wanted to go to New Orleans since we read about the architecture in school, the iron lacework on the balconies. She said it with the focused reverence of a person who has been thinking about something for a long time and is ready to see it in person. New Orleans is on the list, he said. I know, she said. I looked at the Harrington Tech project announcements last night when I couldn't sleep. He blinked. You knew about this last night. There was a press release, she said, from 6 months ago, about a community rebuilding initiative, 7 cities. It didn't name a project director yet. She met his eyes. I figured it out when you texted that it was getting interesting. He looked at his daughter across the kitchen table. She looked back at him with the patient expression of someone who has long accepted that the adults in their life occasionally need a moment to catch up. You are something else, he said. She smiled, small and real. I know. He shook his head slowly. He was going to have feelings about this moment later, probably at an inconvenient time on a job site or in a meeting or driving somewhere at night. He was going to have feelings about this child and this kitchen and this morning, and they were going to be the good kind. Eat your cereal, he said. She ate her cereal. He ate his. He called Victoria at 9 o'clock. She answered before the second ring. I didn't expect to hear from you until next week, she said. Based on what I know about how you process things. I drove 4 hours, he said. I had time. Fair. A pause. How are you feeling about it this morning? Good, he said, and he meant it. Not the performed good of someone who's made a decision and is committed to defending it. The actual good of clarity. I want to move fast on the community partnership pieces. That has to be established before anything structural gets touched. Before I even walk through the buildings with my crew, the communities need to be at the table first. Agreed, she said. And I need access to your full team, he said. Not reports, actual access. I need to know who I'm working with before I can tell you how to structure anything. I'll set up a meeting for Thursday, she said. Chicago, the whole project team. Bring the charter, he said. I want to read Article 7 myself. It'll be in your email by noon today. He thought about something. Can I ask you something? Yes. Article 7, he said. The Community Partnership Framework. How did you write it? Who told you that was the right approach? A pause. Not hesitation, consideration. Nobody told me, she said. I grew up in a neighborhood that got developed, she said. Not restored, developed. There's a difference. The buildings went away, and new ones came, and the people who'd been there for decades were priced out in 3 years. A pause. I know what it looks like when a community receives change instead of participating in it. I know what gets lost. A brief silence. The charter says what it says because I've been on the other side of what happens when it doesn't. Caleb was quiet. He thought about something his father had said once, driving past a neighborhood that had been gutted and rebuilt in the particular anonymous style of development that could be anywhere and therefore is nowhere. His father had said they took the memory out of it, not angrily, just noting it. With the quiet grief of someone who understands what that means. Victoria, he said. Yeah. I think we're going to build something good, he said. Another pause. When she spoke, her voice was a shade different from its usual register. Not softer exactly, more unguarded. I think so too, she said. I've thought so for 3 years. He almost said something further and then didn't. Some things didn't need more words wrapped around them. Thursday, he said. Thursday, she said. He hung up. He put the phone on the table. Sophie was in the living room now, reorganizing the books she'd left on the couch, doing it by some system he could never quite identify, not alphabetical, not by color, something more instinctive than either. Thursday I have a meeting in Chicago, he said. School's off Thursday, she said without looking up. Teacher workday. He looked at her. You want to come? She looked up from the books. Her expression was doing the complicated thing again, the surprise and not surprise. To a meeting, she said. You already know the project better than I do, he said. And you've been doing my research without telling me for a year. You may as well sit in the room. Sophie looked at him for a moment. Then she said, I'll need to print something. What? I made a map, she said, of the 7 cities, with the historic preservation sites in each one that are currently at risk. I was going to show you eventually. I may as well bring it to the meeting. He stared at her. Dad, she said patiently, it's a good map. He sat down on the couch next to the reorganizing project. He sat there for a moment. Then he said, Sophie. Yeah. When I was at the reunion last night, he said, someone asked me what my greatest achievement was. She looked at him. What did you say? I didn't say anything, he said. But I knew the answer. She held very still. You, he said. It's you. Everything else I've built, the buildings, the projects, the work, all of it is something I'm proud of. But you are the thing I look at and think, I did that right. You are the version of everything I believe about how a person should be that actually exists in the world. He paused. You're 9 years old, and you made a map of at-risk historic preservation sites in 7 cities because you wanted to understand what your father was going to be asked to do. That's not normal, Sophie. That's remarkable. Sophie looked at him with eyes that were very bright and very steady. I learned it from Sarah, she said. He nodded. Once. Slowly. She reached over and put her hand on his arm for exactly 1 second, her version of a hug when she was trying to stay composed, and then went back to the books. He sat beside her for a while. The morning moved around them. Outside, the city was doing what cities do, the muffled sounds of it, the life of it. The particular noise of a Saturday morning, in a neighborhood where families were waking up and going about the ordinary, remarkable business of their lives. He thought about 42,000 people in 37 neighborhoods. He thought about what those numbers became multiplied across 7 cities. I thought about buildings that held memory for communities that needed the memory held. About walls that remembered things. About the difference between development and restoration. The difference between imposing a new thing and recovering what was always there. He thought about a 22-year-old girl on a bench outside a financial aid office doing the arithmetic of an impossible situation. He thought about what it meant to change someone's arithmetic. I thought about all the buildings in this country right now that were being condemned or sold or demolished because nobody in the room had both the knowledge of what they were worth and the will to act on it. He thought about Thursday. He thought about New Orleans and iron lacework on balconies and a 9-year-old who had made a map. He picked up one of Sophie's books from the pile she was sorting through, turned it over, put it back. What system are you using? He asked. For the books. She didn't look up. Emotional order, she said. What does that mean? The books I need most are closest, she said. Not the ones I love most. The ones I need most. There's a difference. He looked at the pile, looked at her. Yeah, he said. There is. She finally looked up at him. Are you nervous? She asked. About Thursday. About all of it. He thought about it. He thought about the road at midnight, lit 100 feet at a time. About trusting that the road was still there beyond the headlights. About the moment you stop running the math and just do the thing. No, he said. She studied him. Good nervous or actually not nervous? Actually not nervous, he said. For the first time in a long time, I know exactly what the work is. I know why it matters. I know who I'm doing it with. He paused. That's not a feeling that leaves a lot of room for nervous. Sophie looked at him with an expression he'd seen before, not often, but sometimes in moments when something clicked for her. The expression of a person who has received information that is going to reorganize other information around it. "Okay," she said. She went back to the books. He sat beside her in the quiet of the morning, and outside the city went about its life. And somewhere in Chicago, a team was preparing for Thursday, and somewhere in 7 cities buildings were waiting to be found by someone who could see what they were meant to be. And for the first time in a long time, the quiet didn't feel like something he was choosing instead of something else. It felt like the stillness before work begins. The good kind. The kind that means you know what you're doing and you're ready to do it, and the only thing left is the doing. He reached over and pulled one of Sophie's books off the reorganized pile just to see where she'd put it. It was at the top. He turned it over, read the cover. It was a book about architecture, old buildings, the kind that last. He put it back exactly where she'd placed it. "Good system," he said. "I know," she said. Thursday came with the particular clarity of a Chicago October morning. The kind of cold that doesn't apologize for itself, that arrives fully formed and expects you to be ready for it. Caleb was ready. He'd been up at 5:30, not because he'd set an alarm, but because he'd slept all he was going to sleep, and his body understood that today was the kind of day that required being awake for all of it. He made coffee. He stood at the kitchen window and drank it, looking out at the street below, watching the neighborhood rouse itself. The man who walked his dog at the same time every morning. The woman from the 3rd floor who always left for work 20 minutes before anyone else on the block. The delivery truck that idled too long outside the corner store on Tuesdays and Thursdays with mechanical reliability. He'd watched this street for 6 years. He knew its rhythms the way he knew the structural patterns of old buildings, not from study, from presence. From paying attention over time. Sophie appeared in the kitchen at 6:45 dressed and carrying her backpack and the rolled-up map she'd printed the night before, which she'd secured with a rubber band and labeled in her careful handwriting, Harrington Initiative Priority Sites by City. She set it on the table and poured herself cereal without comment, because in Sophie's world, being prepared was not something that required announcement. "You labeled it," Caleb said. "Maps should be labeled," she said. He looked at it. "Can I see it?" She slid it across without putting down her spoon. He unrolled it on the table, holding both ends down with his coffee mug and a book she'd left on the table edge. It was a real map, not a child's approximation of one. She'd pulled topographical data and overlaid it with zoning information and historical preservation registry status for each of the 7 cities, marking at-risk structures in red and recently restored ones in blue, and the ones that were in the gray zone could go either way, depending on whether anyone with resources showed up in yellow. There were notes in the margins. Small, precise, researched notes about specific buildings. Population data. Community organization contacts she'd apparently found through some combination of internet research and what appeared to be direct email inquiry. He looked up at her. She was eating her cereal with the focused neutrality of someone who is aware they've done something impressive and is choosing not to make anything of it. "Sophie," he said. "Yeah." "How long did this take you?" "Since September," she said. "Of this year. Of last year." He put the map down. He looked at his daughter. "I wanted to understand what you were doing," she said simply. "All of it. Not just the buildings I could see from the truck. The whole picture." She paused. "And then the Harrington press release came out in March, and I thought that's it. That's the thing. That's what Dad's work connects to, if someone gives it room to connect." She met his eyes. "I just didn't know how to tell you without it sounding like I was pushing." "You weren't pushing," he said. "I know," she said. "But you have this thing where you don't like when people tell you what direction to go. You like to find it yourself." He was quiet. "I got it from you," she said. Not accusingly, just accurately. He rolled the map back up carefully, the way you handle something that matters. "Can I take this today? To the meeting?" She looked at him with an expression that said she had of course printed it specifically for this purpose. "That's why I labeled it," she said. "Don't know." The Harrington Technology offices occupied 4 floors of a building in the West Loop that had in a previous life been a printing facility. The original brick exterior preserved the industrial bones, visible in the interior ceiling structure, the kind of conversion that Caleb immediately respected on sight because whoever had overseen it had understood that the history of the building was an asset, not an obstacle. He noticed that. He noticed it and filed it away as information about Victoria, about what she valued about the alignment between what she said and what she'd actually built her world around. Sophie noticed it too. She stood in the lobby and looked up at the preserved ceiling structure with the expression she'd had on the sidewalk outside the Palmer Street Theater that transfixed reading what it was meant to be quality. "Good bones," she said quietly. "Yeah," Caleb said. They were met in the lobby by a man named James, who had the efficient warmth of someone who was very good at his job and knew it without needing to signal it. He was Victoria's chief of staff, he explained, and he'd been briefed on the meeting. He looked at Sophie with the brief recalibration of someone who had not expected a 9-year-old and was determining how to adjust. Sophie extended her hand. "Sophie Whitmore," she said. "I have a map." James shook her hand with complete seriousness. "James Okafor. I look forward to seeing it." They rode the elevator to the 14th floor. The meeting room was already occupied when they arrived. 6 people around a table: architects, urban planners, a community liaison specialist, a nonprofit finance director. All of them with folders and laptops and the focused energy of people who had been working on something for a long time and were finally in the room where it became real. They looked at Caleb. They looked at Sophie. Victoria was at the head of the table. She stood when they came in, which surprised Caleb slightly, not because it was unusual, but because it was genuine. The gesture of someone who respected the person walking through the door. "Caleb," she said, and then to Sophie, "You must be Sophie." Sophie looked at her with the clear-eyed assessment she applied to people she was meeting for the first time and forming opinions about. "You're shorter than I thought you'd be," she said. A half-second of absolute silence. Then Victoria laughed. A real laugh, the same one she'd given Caleb in the corridor at the reunion, the one with no performance in it. "I get that a lot," she said. "My dad is tall," Sophie explained. "Most of his friends are tall. It adjusts my calibration." "Perfectly reasonable," Victoria said. She gestured to the table. "Sit wherever you'd like." Caleb sat. Sophie sat beside him, set her backpack on the floor, placed the rolled map on the table in front of her, and folded her hands on top of it with the composed readiness of someone who has been in professional meetings her whole life, which she essentially had been. The 6 people around the table watched this with varying degrees of visible curiosity. "Before we get into the framework," Caleb said, looking around the table, "I want to know who everyone is, not your titles, who you are. What drew you to this work specifically? What you've done before that you're proud of, and what you've done that didn't work the way you intended." A pause. The woman across from him, the community liaison specialist according to the placard, looked at him with an expression that recalibrated slightly, as if she'd prepared for a different kind of opening. "I'll go first," Caleb said. "I'm Caleb Whitmore. I've been doing historic restoration for 10 years, mostly in the Midwest, all community-focused, none of it famous. I've saved 37 buildings. I've made mistakes on about a third of them, not structural mistakes, relational ones. Times when I moved faster than the community needed me to move, or made decisions that should have been theirs. I'm here because I've learned from those mistakes, and because I think this initiative structured correctly can do something that individual projects can't." He paused. "That's me. Who are you?" The room shifted, not dramatically, but perceptibly. The way a room shifts when it understands what kind of meeting it's actually in. They went around the table. Their names, their work, their honest assessments of what had and hadn't worked in their careers. By the end of it, 40 minutes had passed, and Caleb had a much clearer picture of who he was working with than any resume would have given him. What he found was better than he'd expected. The architect, a woman named Priya, who'd spent 7 years in New Orleans, post-Katrina reconstruction, had the specific knowledge of community trauma that comes only from working inside it. The urban planner, a man named Deshawn, who'd grown up in one of Baltimore's most distressed neighborhoods, had the kind of ground-level understanding of what communities actually needed, as opposed to what developers assumed they needed, that couldn't be acquired from outside. The nonprofit finance director, a woman named Carol, had structured funding models for 17 community preservation projects and knew exactly which approaches collapsed under pressure and which ones held. These were not people assembled for optics. These were people assembled because they knew things. He looked at Victoria across the table. She met his eyes. He gave her the smallest nod. She received it without expression, but something in her settled. Article 7, Caleb said, opening his copy of the charter. Let's start here. They worked for 4 hours. Real work, not the kind of meeting where decisions get made later by smaller groups in different rooms, but the kind where the actual framework gets built in real time in the room, with everyone's knowledge contributing to the structure. Caleb drove it the way he drove job sites, directly, without ceremony, with complete intolerance for vagueness. When someone said, "We'll handle the community engagement piece," he asked what that meant specifically, who was responsible, what the timeline was, what the decision-making authority looked like. When the answer was unclear, they worked it out until it wasn't. Sophie sat beside him and didn't speak for the first 2 hours. Then Deshawn, the urban planner, put up a map of Baltimore's community structure on the screen and started talking about a specific neighborhood on the city's east side where 2 historic structures had been lost in the past 18 months to what he described as preventable demolition buildings that were viable but fell through the cracks of the assessment process. Sophie looked at the map. "That's Eager Street," she said. Deshawn stopped. He looked at her. Everyone at the table looked at her. "The Eager Street corridor," she said with the careful tone of someone double-checking their own knowledge against the map on the screen. The 2 buildings that were demolished, one was the 1887 row house block at 1423, and one was the former Stonewall Community Hall at the corner of Federal. She paused. The community hall had a structural assessment done in 2021 that found the foundation was repairable. The demolition happened 18 months later, which means the assessment was done, and then nothing happened for 18 months, and then it was too late. Deshawn was looking at her with an expression that had passed through surprise and was arriving somewhere on the far side of it. "Where did you?" he started. "Maryland Historical Trust Public Records," she said. "And the Baltimore City Department of Housing Demolition Permits database." She paused. "I have it on the map." She unrolled her map on the table. The room leaned in. Caleb watched the 6 people around the table look at what his 9-year-old daughter had built over 14 months in her spare time, and he watched their expressions move through various versions of the same recalibration. Not condescension, adjusting upward. They were past that within the first 30 seconds of looking at it. Something more like recognition. The recognition of people who know careful work when they see it and are encountering it in an unexpected form. "Is this?" Priya leaned closer. "These yellow markers. What's the classification system?" "At-risk structures with viable restoration windows," Sophie said. "Meaning the structural assessment data, where it exists, suggests the building is repairable, but the window is closing based on current condition reports and development pressure in the area." She pointed to a cluster of yellow markers in New Orleans. "These are the ones I'd prioritize. The Iron Lacework District. 3 of these buildings have had no official assessment in over 8 years, and the neighborhood's development pressure index has gone up 40% since 2020. "How did you calculate the development pressure index?" Carol asked. Sophie looked at her. "Property transaction, data zoning variance applications, business license changes and rental price shifts over a 5-year rolling window," she said. "It's not a standard metric. I built it." Carol looked at Caleb. Caleb looked back at her with an expression that said, "I know. She's mine. I have the same reaction every day." Victoria was watching all of this from the head of the table with an expression that was quiet and still and very, very focused. "Sophie," she said. Sophie looked at her. "Would you be willing to share this data with our team? The full data set, the methodology." "Yes," Sophie said. "I'd want to be part of how it gets used, though, to make sure the methodology is applied correctly." A pause. "The development pressure index especially. It's easy to misread if you don't understand what each variable is weighted for. Done, Victoria said. Victoria, Caleb said. Yeah. She's 9. I know. Victoria looked at him. Do you want me to pretend the work isn't what it is because of her age? He looked at his daughter. Sophie was already carefully re-rolling the map, satisfied with the exchange moving forward. No, he said. Good, Victoria said. They broke for lunch at noon. Someone had arranged food in the adjoining room. Real food, the kind that suggested someone on the team, understood that people who work think better when they're actually fed, rather than performatively offered catering. Sophie claimed a corner of the table and ate methodically while reading something on her phone, which Caleb recognized as her processing mode. She'd taken in a lot in the last 4 hours and was reorganizing it internally and needed quiet to do it. Victoria appeared beside Caleb at the food table. She's extraordinary, Victoria said quietly. Don't tell her, Caleb said. She already knows, and the last thing she needs is external confirmation making her self-conscious about it. Victoria glanced at Sophie across the room. You've raised her to be completely herself. I raised her to think clearly and care about what matters, Caleb said. She did the rest. A pause. Can I ask you something? Victoria said. Yeah. The morning after the reunion, she said. When you texted me at 3 in the morning, the community partnership condition. She paused. You already knew it was in the charter. You'd read the press release. You told me Sophie had read the press release. You knew. He looked at her. So why did you text it as a condition? She asked. What were you actually testing? He was quiet for a moment. I needed to know if your first instinct was to defend the charter or to reaffirm the value behind it, he said. If you'd said, yes, it's already covered, it's in Article 7. That's a legal answer. An administrative answer. It would have told me you were protecting the document. He paused. You said it was the first thing I wrote. That's a different answer. That's a values answer. That's someone telling me why the thing exists, not just that it exists. Victoria looked at him steadily. That's what I was testing, he said. She was quiet for a moment. Caleb, she said, I want to tell you something, and I need you to hear it as information, not as... She paused. Not as something you have to respond to. All right. When I was 22 years old sitting on that bench, she said, I had already made a decision. I'd already decided in the 2 hours I spent on the floor of my apartment that I was going to leave. Take the leave of absence. Go home. Maybe come back someday, but probably not. She paused. And then you sat down next to me, and you asked if I was okay. And I said yes, and you didn't believe me, and you asked again. And I told you some of it. Caleb remembered. The bench, the late afternoon light, the financial aid office door behind her. You didn't try to fix it immediately, she said. You didn't immediately offer solutions, or suggestions, or perspective. You just listened to it. You let me say what it was, and you sat with it. A pause. And then 2 days later, the transfer happened. But here's the thing, even before the transfer, something shifted. Because someone had sat next to me and listened, and believed that what I was experiencing was real and serious. That by itself changed something. She paused. The money saved my degree. But you actually saved me before that, at the bench. Caleb stood still. I wanted you to know that, she said. Not because it changes anything about the project or the partnership, just because you should know. He didn't speak for a moment. He thought about that afternoon. How he'd almost walked past her. How he'd been in a hurry headed to the library, some deadline, something that had felt urgent, and he no longer remembered. How he'd slowed down because something in her posture had caught him. Not distress. She wasn't visibly distressed. Just the stillness of someone who has run out of options and is sitting very quietly with that fact. He'd slowed down. He'd sat. I almost didn't stop, he said. I know, she said. Most people didn't. He looked at the food on the table in front of him without seeing it. Victoria, he said. Yeah. I'm glad I stopped. She looked at him. For you, he said. Obviously for what it became, and what you built, and what you're building now. But also, just for you. For the person sitting on that bench who had done everything right and hit a wall that had nothing to do with how hard she'd worked. He paused. Nobody deserves that. Nobody should have to sit there and do that arithmetic alone. She held very still. That's why this project matters, he said. Not the buildings. The buildings are the vehicle. What matters is that in 7 cities right now, there are people who have done everything right and hit walls that have nothing to do with their effort. And we're going to show up and sit down and change their arithmetic. He paused. That's the work. Victoria looked at him for a long moment. Then she said very quietly, "Then let's do the work." They went back to the table. They worked for 3 more hours. By the time they finished, the framework had moved from document to plan. Specific. Detailed. Each city with its own timeline, its own community, liaison structure, its own priority site list, and in the margin of the Chicago section. In careful pencil, someone had written, "See Sophie W. map," with an arrow pointing to a note about the development pressure index methodology. Deshawn had written it. He'd done it without comment, just written it, and kept going. Caleb had seen it and not said anything. Some things didn't require comment. The meeting ended at 4:30. People gathered folders and laptops, exchanged information, broke into smaller conversations that would continue into the evening. The particular energy of a group that has spent a day doing real work, tired and energized. At the same time, the specific combination that means something was actually built. Priya stopped by Caleb's chair on her way out. "The Halbrook Theater," she said. "I've read the case study 3 times. The plasterwork restoration under the original paint layers. The approach you used, I've been trying to adapt it for a project in Tremé. Can I send you some photographs?" "Send them," he said. "I'll look at them this week." She nodded, and something in her expression was simply the recognition of one person who knows what they're doing to another. Carol stopped next. "The funding structure for Detroit is going to need a creative approach," she said. "The municipal partnership component has some complications. Can we find an hour before next week?" "Monday morning," he said. 7 a.m. "I'm an early starter." She smiled. "So am I." Deshawn was last. He stopped in front of Caleb and didn't say anything for a moment, just looked at him with the particular expression of someone who has decided to say something real instead of something convenient. "I grew up in Cherry Hill," Deshawn said. "South Baltimore, about 6 blocks from the Eager Street corridor your daughter was talking about." He paused. "The Stonewall Community Hall, the one that got demolished." Caleb waited. "My grandmother used to take me there on Saturday mornings," Deshawn said. "Community breakfast, every Saturday for 12 years. The building smelled like coffee and old wood, and that specific way old buildings smell when they've been full of people for a long time." He paused. "When it came down, I drove past the lot, and I just sat there. Just sat in my car and looked at where it had been." "I'm sorry," Caleb said. "I wanted you to know why I'm here," Deshawn said. "Not the resume version, the real version." He paused. "That's the building I'm working to prevent. Every time. Every city. Every project." He put out his hand. "I'm glad you're doing this." Caleb shook it. "I'm glad you are too." Deshawn left. Sophie appeared at Caleb's elbow, backpack on MapTube under her arm, ready. "Good meeting," she said. "Yeah," Caleb said. "Deshawn is going to be important," she said. "I know. Priya too. I know." Carol knows things nobody else in the room knows about how money actually moves through nonprofit structures, Sophie said. She was correcting things in her head while other people were talking. You could see it. Caleb looked at her. "You noticed that." She kept making small notes in the margin and then crossing them out, Sophie said. "That's someone with a different answer who's being polite about having it." She paused. "We should ask her about the margins. The crossed-out things are probably the real concerns." He looked at his daughter for a long moment. "Sophie," he said, "when you're older, whatever you decide to do, whatever direction you go." He paused. "The world is going to be lucky." She looked at him with that still serious expression. "I'm going to be an architect," she said. "I've decided." "When did you decide?" "When I was 4, she said. And I've been confirming it every year since. She paused. Today was more confirming. He put his hand on her shoulder briefly. Come on, let's go home. Victoria walked them out. In the elevator, Sophie asked Victoria about the building conversion, the preserved ceiling structure, the original brick, the decisions made about what to keep and what to change. Victoria told her in real detail without simplifying for her age. About the original plans and the debate over how much industrial history to preserve, and the moment she'd decided that the memory of what the building had been was as important as the utility of what it was becoming. Sophie listened with complete attention. In the lobby, Victoria shook Caleb's hand. Then she looked at Sophie. The map, she said. I meant what I said in the meeting. We want to use it, but I want to make sure you understand your name goes on it. Your methodology, your work, that's yours. Sophie looked at her steadily. I know, she said. I wasn't worried about that. Victoria smiled. No, I didn't think you were. She paused. Sophie, can I ask you something? Yes. Why did you spend 14 months building a map of at-risk historic sites across 7 cities? Sophie considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. Because my dad spends his life saving buildings that would otherwise be lost, she said. And I wanted to understand the full scale of what was being lost, so I could understand the full scale of what he was fighting. She paused. And because somebody should know, even if it's just me, somebody should know which buildings are still there and which ones are running out of time. Victoria was very still. Somebody should know, she repeated quietly. Yes, Sophie said. They stood in the lobby for a moment, the preserved brick, the industrial ceiling, the light coming through the tall windows in the particular way of a late October afternoon. The building around them was doing what good buildings do, holding the memory of what it had been while making room for what it was becoming. Victoria looked at Caleb. Thursday in 3 weeks, she said. First site visit, Chicago. The Garfield Park corridor. There's a 1903 civic building that's been on the demolition list for 2 years. I want your eyes on it. I'll be there, he said. She nodded. Once. The nod of someone who has said what needed saying and trusts that the rest will follow. She went back to the elevator. Caleb and Sophie walked out through the lobby doors into the October afternoon, and the cold came at them directly and completely, the way Chicago cold does, without negotiation, without apology, just the fact of it. Sophie pulled her jacket tighter and looked up at the facade of the building behind them. The preserved brick, the original cornices, the history of the thing intact. Good building, she said. Yeah, Caleb said. They walked to the truck. He called Marcus on the drive back. How was it? Marcus said. Real, Caleb said. Real good or real complicated? Both, Caleb said. The right kind of both. A pause. Team looks solid. Solid, Caleb said. Deshaun knows Baltimore from the inside. Priya knows New Orleans from the reconstruction. Carol understands nonprofit funding in ways that are going to matter when the municipalities get difficult, and they will. He paused. You're going to like them. When do I meet them? I'm going to set up a full crew meeting before the first site visit, Caleb said. 3 weeks, Chicago, Garfield Park. I'll be there, Marcus said. Simone's going to have the baby by then, so I'll need a reason to get out of the house before I drive everyone crazy. Caleb almost smiled. How is she? Perfect, Marcus said. The word came out with the particular weight of a man who means it entirely. She's perfect and she's ready, and she keeps reorganizing the nursery, and I've stopped pointing out that she already reorganized it perfectly the first 2 times. Smart strategy. I've learned some things in 7 years of marriage, Marcus said. In the passenger seat. Sophie was looking out the window at the city moving past her map tube in her lap, her expression, the particular distant quality of someone running through things in their head. Caleb watched her in his peripheral vision, the set of her jaw, the way she held the map, like it was something that mattered. Marcus, Caleb said. Sophie's going to be involved in the data analysis side of the project, the at-risk site prioritization. A brief silence. The 9-year-old, Marcus said. She built the priority site map. It's better than anything the existing team had. Deshaun confirmed it in the meeting. Another silence. Caleb, Marcus said. That kid is going to run the world. I know, Caleb said. You aware of that? Like fully aware. Every day, Caleb said. Sophie looked over at him with the expression of someone who knows they're being talked about and is choosing not to acknowledge it. Get some rest, Caleb told Marcus. 3 weeks. 3 weeks, Marcus said. He hung up. They drove. The city gave way to the highway, and the highway opened up, and the afternoon light came in low and golden from the west. The way October light does not warm exactly, but luminous, the kind of light that makes ordinary things look significant. Dad, Sophie said. Yeah. What she said, in the meeting, about the buildings being the vehicle. She paused. That was your phrase, wasn't it, from somewhere? He thought about it. I've said it before, on job sites. Marcus uses it too, she said. I've heard him say it. He says the building is the vehicle, the community is the destination. She paused. Did you teach him that? I don't know, Caleb said. That's the thing about ideas. After a while you can't always tell where they started. Sophie was quiet for a moment. I want to add something to it, she said. He waited. The community is the destination, she said. But the memory is the fuel. She paused. If you lose the memory, if you take down the buildings without understanding what they held, you run out of fuel. You can build new things, but they don't go anywhere because there's nothing powering them forward. She looked at him. That's why the restoration matters. Not just the structure, the memory inside it. He drove. He thought about his father saying they took the memory out of it. He thought about a woman named Ruth, who'd written him 3 pages about what it meant to walk her granddaughter through a library where her own mother had borrowed books. He thought about the walls that remember things. He thought about a 22-year-old girl on a bench who had decided to leave, and then because someone sat down and changed the arithmetic, didn't. I thought about what that decision compounded into over 20 years. One person sitting down on a bench. $14 billion. 7 cities. 42,000 people and counting. The memory is the fuel, he said. Sophie looked at him. That's exactly right, he said. Write that down. She pulled out her phone and typed it without ceremony, the way she documented things quickly, without making anything of it already, thinking about how it connected to other things. He drove the rest of the way home in the low October light. 1 year later, the Garfield Park Civic Building reopened. It was a Tuesday evening in October, exactly 1 year after the first site visit, and the neighborhood had turned out in a way that Caleb hadn't quite anticipated, even though he'd watched it build over 12 months of work. The community meetings, the decision sessions where residents sat at the same table as architects and actually made choices that stuck, the slow accumulation of ownership that happens when people are treated as partners instead of recipients. The building itself was restored to the 1903 original on the exterior, with the interior adapted for contemporary community. Used meeting rooms, a learning center, a small performance space, a kitchen designed for the community meal programs that had been operating out of a church basement 3 blocks away for 11 years and finally had a real home. The plasterwork on the main hall ceiling had taken 6 weeks. Caleb's hands had been in it for 4 of them. He stood on the sidewalk outside before the ceremony started in the early evening cold, and he looked at the building. Marcus appeared beside him. 40 years minimum, Marcus said. Structural integrity done right. 40 years before she needs major work again. 50, Caleb said. The foundation work we did. Marcus looked at him, smiled. 50. How's the baby? Loud, Marcus said. Healthy. Loud. He paused. Simone brought her to the site last week. She looked at the facade for about 30 seconds and then fell asleep. I'm choosing to interpret that as approval. Inside the building, people were gathering. Caleb could see them through the restored windows, the large original glass cleaned and resealed, framing the lit interior like a painting. Families. Elders. Young people who'd grown up in this neighborhood and stayed, and others who'd left and come back, and others who were here for the first time and were finding out what the place had been and what it was becoming. Victoria appeared beside him on the sidewalk. She looked at the building. She said nothing for a moment. "The windows," she said finally. "Original glass," Caleb said. 1903, all of it intact under 6 layers of paint and weatherproofing. "How did you know to look?" "You always look," he said. "Before you decide something's gone, you look." She was quiet. "Article 7 held," she said. "In every meeting, every decision point, the community partnership framework held." "It held because it was built right," Caleb said. "You wrote it right." She looked at him. "We implemented it right. That's different." He acknowledged that with a nod. Deshawn came out through the front door and waved them in. Behind him through the open doorway. Caleb could hear it, the sound of a full room, people talking and moving, the particular acoustic of a building that is doing exactly what it was meant to do. "Dad." He turned. Sophie had come out from inside. She was in her good coat, the navy one, and she had a notebook in her hand because she always had a notebook when she was working, and she'd been working all evening, talking to residents, documenting responses, asking the questions she'd designed for the community, impact assessment she'd been building alongside the project for the last 12 months. She stood in front of the building and looked up at it, just as she'd stood on the sidewalk outside the Palmer Street Theater 3 years ago before it was finished, and described exactly what it was going to look like when it was. "Someone I talked to tonight," she said. "A woman named Mrs. Patterson. She's 74. She used to come to this building as a girl. Her mother brought her here for a community supper the first winter they moved to the neighborhood. She said she was 7 years old, and it was the first place in the city that felt like it was theirs." She paused. "She walked in tonight, and she stopped in the doorway, and she didn't move for a while, and then she said..." Sophie checked her notebook. "It's exactly the same. The ceiling is exactly the same." Caleb looked at the ceiling visible through the window. He'd spent 4 weeks on that ceiling. She said. Sophie continued reading carefully. "I thought I'd lost it. I thought it was just gone. But someone kept it." Sophie looked up from the notebook. "And then she asked who did the restoration, and I told her your name." He stood on the sidewalk in the October evening, in front of a building that had been condemned and was now full of people, and he felt something that he hadn't felt in a long time, or had felt in small doses quietly on job sites when the work was finished and right. He felt it at scale now. The particular feeling of a thing being returned to the people it belonged to. "Dad," Sophie said. She was looking at him with the clear-eyed directness she'd always had. "She wants to meet you." He looked at the building. He looked at his daughter. He thought about the arithmetic of a life, the math of small decisions that compound over decades into things you couldn't have predicted from where you started. A bank line, a bench, a worn jacket, and a 4-hour drive, and a room full of people who had already decided what a man was worth. He thought about what it meant to build things that last, not just buildings, the other things. The things you build inside people when you treat them like they matter. The things you build inside a child when you model what it looks like to do the right thing when nobody's watching. The things you build inside a community when you show up not to impose something new, but to recover what was always theirs. He thought about Mrs. Patterson at 7 years old, in a building that felt like theirs for the first time. He thought about her at 74, standing in the doorway, looking at a ceiling that was the same. He thought about someone kept it. He looked at Sophie. "Let's go meet her," he said. Sophie fell into step beside him. They walked up the steps and through the door into the sound and warmth of a full building. A building that remembered what it was and was ready for what it was. Becoming a building that stood because someone had believed it was worth saving when no one else would. The door closed behind them. And the work, the real work, the kind that doesn't end when the project does, the kind that keeps compounding forward through the people it touches, and the memories it keeps, and the futures it quietly makes possible, continued. As it always had. As it always would. Because that is what happens when one person decides that doing the right thing doesn't require it to be simple. It just requires you to decide.